Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Silent Laboratory, the monastic roots of alchemical practice. The monastery was cold, even in spring. Its walls, thick with centuries of moss and dust, held a silence so deep it could almost be mistaken for reverence. Stone corridors twisted beneath vaulted ceilings, and the smell of old parchment, beeswax, and fermented herbs filled the air like the residue of 1,000 prayers. Here, behind these walls, was not only a place of devotion but a place of study, a peculiar type of study not always spoken of aloud. You might imagine a monk at prayer, or tending to a garden. But imagine him also hunched over a mortar and pestle, measuring powders by candlelight, mumbling incantations not found in the Gospels. This is where our story begins, not with gold or glory, but with silence. The role of the monastery in early alchemical practice. In the early Middle Ages, especially from the 8th to the 12th centuries, European monasteries were the last strongholds of learning in a post-Roman world that had lost much of its infrastructure and cohesion. They were not merely houses of worship, they were intellectual ecosystems. The Benedictines, in particular, followed a rule that emphasized ora et labora, prayer and work. And work, in the medieval sense, often meant the transcription of texts, herbal experimentation, and the occasional curiosity that bordered on the arcane. Some of these monks were more than just scribes. They became, in practice if not in name, early alchemists. But why alchemy? Alchemy in medieval monasteries was often hidden under layers of metaphor. It was not taught in schools or debated openly. It was transmitted quietly, like a shared secret. And it wasn't about turning lead into gold, at least not only. It was about the refinement of the soul, the search for divine wisdom, and the belief that matter and spirit were connected in ways most had forgotten. Pseudo-Dionysius and the idea of divine transformation. One of the theological frameworks that supported such thinking came from Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, whose mystical writings filtered into the Latin West during the early medieval period. He spoke of divine hierarchies and the transformation of the soul through layers of understanding and purification. The parallels to alchemy were subtle but clear. The soul was base metal, salvation was gold, and between the two was a process of calcination, dissolution, separation, a series of trials, mirrored in the spiritual journey of the devout monk and the physical experiment of the careful practitioner. Even when alchemical texts were later condemned or controlled, this early monastic alchemy survived camouflaged by theology. The herbalist as alchemist. Imagine Brother Theophilus in the year 987 AD, deep in a scriptorium in what is now modern-day Germany. He has a garden filled with valerian, yarrow, and angelica. He writes a treatise on inks, metals, and glass. And between copying psalms and grinding seeds, he takes careful notes on the reaction of mercury to heat. He would not have called himself an alchemist. He might not have even known the term. But his actions mirrored what Jabir ibn Hayyan in the Abbasid world or Zosimos in Alexandria would have recognized: an exploration of nature's hidden language. A scriptorium of secrets. Texts were few and precious. Many of the earliest Western alchemical texts were translations poorly copied, often misunderstood of Arabic and Greek originals. Sometimes they were passed off as ancient authorities, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus or Apollonius of Tyana. Other times they were fragmentary, recipes and symbols copied into the margins of prayer books, metaphors that blended spiritual renewal with chemical change. The monks preserved them not necessarily because they fully understood them, but because they understood the pattern. Wisdom was hidden, and its discovery required patience. This was a world where even mundane materials had spiritual weight. Salt was not only a preservative, it symbolized endurance. Wine wasn't just for the Eucharist, it became a solvent. The distillation of herbs could echo the purification of the soul. Everything was symbolic. Everything had layers. The alchemical chapel. A few monasteries preserved more than just texts, they preserved spaces. In some abbeys across France and the Holy Roman Empire, small rooms adjacent to kitchens or infirmaries were used as rudimentary laboratories. These weren't equipped with glowing beakers or brass instruments. They featured clay furnaces, glass alembics, and iron tongs. Often, their presence was disguised recorded in inventory books as brewing equipment or apothecary tools. These laboratories were quiet places. They echoed not with explosions or chants, but with the slow hiss of heat and the whisper of pages turning. The monks who used them weren't seeking fame. They sought understanding of the body, of nature, of God. From gold to God, alchemy as devotion. Here, the goal was never material transmutation. It was anagogical, a lifting of the mind to divine truths. The transformation of base metals into gold was not literal but allegorical. It signified the conversion of a sinful, flawed self into a perfected soul. Many early alchemical texts in Latin weren't instruction manuals so much as meditations. The aqua vitae wasn't just a chemical substance, it was a symbol of Christ's blood, of eternal life. The philosopher's stone represented Christ himself. The stone the builders rejected, the key to salvation. This was not heretical, not yet. It was hidden, yes, but not forbidden. It existed in a shadowed corner of orthodoxy where metaphor became method. The threat of curiosity. Yet as time went on, curiosity began to worry the church. By the 12th century, with the rise of scholasticism and the rediscovery of Aristotle, there came a more analytical view of the world and a suspicion of anything that blurred the lines between physical and spiritual truths. The quiet experiments of monastic alchemists began to attract unwanted attention. The line between mystic and heretic was always thin, a whisper in the dark. And yet, in abbeys from Cluny to Canterbury, from Fulda to Monte Cassino, the alchemical whisper remained, hidden in the margins of texts, encoded in symbology, spoken aloud in empty rooms between candle flickers and the tolling of bells. For the monks who practiced it, alchemy was never about power. It was about process. It was the belief that everything, even the human soul, could be made more perfect through fire, patience, and faith. But what happened when that faith came into conflict with the growing machinery of church authority? What happened to the monks, whose curiosity refused to stay within liturgical bounds? The scent of ink had changed. Where once there was the quiet rhythm of transcription and prayer, something new was settling over the scriptoriums of Europe, something more urgent. It was the 12th century now, and the world outside the monastery walls was stirring. Books arrived from distant lands. Ideas long dormant awoke. And with them came suspicion. The alchemy that had once hidden itself so comfortably within the folds of monastic labor now found itself in tension, with a church reasserting its control over spiritual knowledge. The slow-burning harmony between devotion and experimentation began to crack. What had once been meditative inquiry began to appear, to some, as dangerous curiosity. The arrival of the translations. It began with a flood of parchment. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the translation movement that radiated from Muslim Spain, particularly from centers like Toledo and Seville, brought Latin-speaking Europe into sudden contact with the preserved and elaborated wisdom of antiquity. Greek texts once lost to the West, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, returned via Arabic intermediaries, reshaped and reinterpreted by scholars like Avicenna, Al-Kindi, and Jabir ibn Hayyan. Monks in northern Europe were suddenly confronted with concepts that defied easy incorporation into Christian theology. Among these were alchemical doctrines steeped in both metaphor and chemical precision. For monastic alchemists, this was a revelation. The texts they had once only glimpsed in fragmented, allegorical form now appeared in fuller structure. Treatises on distillation, sulfur-mercury theory, and the spiritual purification of substances. But not all saw this as a gift. Scholasticism and the rise of theological control. At the same time, the rise of scholasticism led by thinkers such as Anselm of Canterbury and Peter Abelard brought a new rigor to theological inquiry. The medieval university, which began to emerge in cities like Paris and Bologna, shifted the church's intellectual center of gravity away from monasteries and toward more urban, structured, and regulated environments. Monks who had previously enjoyed relative autonomy in their experimental curiosities now found themselves under greater scrutiny. Curiosity, once a virtue, became a vice in certain theological circles. It was increasingly tied to curiosita's an unhealthy desire to probe God's mysteries beyond what had been divinely revealed. Theological manuals began to classify unauthorized exploration of the natural world as spiritually risky, if not outright heretical. The monastery, once the cradle of learning, now felt a chill wind of oversight. The subtle shift, from alchemy to natural philosophy. As pressure mounted, monastic alchemists adapted their language. No longer would a brother speak of transmuting base metals into gold. Instead, he might frame his work as the study of the qualities of elements, or an exploration of God's craftsmanship within nature. The furnace became a purification chamber, and the alembic, a device for distilling spirits, was rebranded as a tool for apothecary work. This was not deceit, it was survival. Much of medieval alchemy remained cloaked in spiritual language deliberately vague, metaphorically dense, designed to veil the literal beneath layers of theological safety. Recipes and instructions were encrypted. Diagrams became arcane wheels and mandalas. The goal was not to obscure knowledge, but to protect it from the uninitiated and from ecclesiastical oversight. Cistercian silence and alchemical thought. Among the monastic orders, the Cistercians stood apart. Founded in 1098, the order embraced an even stricter form of the Benedictine rule. Their monasteries were often built in remote locations, and their emphasis on simplicity and manual labor made them natural inheritors of early monastic alchemical traditions. But the Cistercians also inherited an uneasy relationship with knowledge. Their great figures, most notably Bernard of Clairvaux, cautioned against intellectual pride. Still, in quiet corners of Cistercian life, herbalism, mineral work, and manuscript copying continued. In some cases, monks even experimented with pigments and metals for use in manuscript illumination, inadvertently brushing against alchemical processes. The irony was not lost on them. In trying to glorify God through beauty and care, they risked accusations of engaging in forbidden arts. Alchemy and the infirmary. A safer domain for alchemical experimentation emerged in the infirmary. Each monastery maintained a place for the sick and elderly, and the infirmary, a monk responsible for their care, often doubled as an herbalist, surgeon, and apothecary. Here, distillation, fermentation, and compound formulation were not merely permitted, they were necessary. Distilling spirits to create tinctures for pain relief, boiling bark to draw out its astringent properties, mixing mercury with herbs to treat skin ailments. All of these processes hovered on the boundary of alchemical science. Some infirmers, like Brother Matthew of St. Albans, documented their processes with surprising detail. In one surviving text, he describes the careful filtration of a herbal tincture through a cloth of linen, thrice folded, and warns against heating certain mixtures too quickly, lest the spirits flee. This language, spirits, flight, transformation, was not only practical, it echoed the metaphysical tones of larger alchemical traditions. The internal conflict, obedience versus discovery. Many monks found themselves caught between vows of obedience and the urge to understand. Take, for instance, the case of Brother Reginald of Cluny, who was reprimanded in 1178 for the keeping of flames beyond permitted hours and the production of odorous vapors. His abbot, in his letter, lamented that Reginald's interests smelled more of Babel than Bethlehem. The metaphor was clear. Alchemy, even when practiced with discipline, risked pride, and pride in the medieval moral universe was the original sin, the engine of Lucifer's fall. But Reginald's writings, preserved only in fragments, reveal a soul genuinely seeking divine understanding. He wrote of the metal's change under fire as a parable for the heart under God's mercy. He compared the process of sublimation to the ascension of prayer. He was not alone in these metaphors. Many monk alchemists considered their work not just compatible with faith, but an extension of it. Still, the tension remained. Manuscripts burned, manuscripts hidden. As alchemical knowledge spread, so too did condemnation. In the early 13th century, a wave of prohibition swept through parts of Europe. Synods in Paris and Oxford began to issue warnings about dangerous arts. Alchemy was not always named directly, but its language, especially when mingled with astrology and necromancy, was folded into broader restrictions. In some cases, manuscripts were destroyed. In others, they were hidden bound between more acceptable texts or stored in private collections only accessible to trusted monks. Marginal notes were scraped clean or rewritten. One manuscript from the Abbey of St. Gilles, for example, shows signs of erasure and rewriting in several key alchemical passages. But under ultraviolet light, scholars have recovered phrases like solve et coagula, dissolve, and bind, a key alchemical principle. This was survival through subtext. Legacy and influence. Despite these tensions, monastic alchemy did not vanish. Instead, it evolved. By the late 13th century, figures like Roger Bacon himself, a Franciscan friar, began to reframe alchemy as a legitimate form of natural philosophy. He called for an empirical approach to knowledge, grounded in observation and experimentation, all while maintaining a deeply Christian worldview. His writings drew heavily on the traditions preserved, often anonymously, in monasteries. The silent laboratories of earlier centuries had laid the foundation for this intellectual expansion. Even if their names were forgotten, the monks who had ground herbs, measured powders, and whispered prayers over flames had shaped the path. The lingering silence. And yet, as the medieval world shifted toward the Renaissance, much of monastic alchemy faded from memory. The laboratories were repurposed. The furnaces went cold, and the margins of manuscripts grew quiet. Still, the symbols remained. The gold-leafed illuminations in certain psalters, the strange marginalia snakes eating their tails, suns rising over crucibles, stars in geometric formation. Hints, echoes, traces of a quieter inquiry. We are left wondering how much knowledge was lost in the silence, how many discoveries were made only to be hidden for fear of rebuke. And in those quiet nights, when the bells had stopped and the candles flickered low, did any monk ever think, what if we're closer to the divine not in prayer, but in fire? The monastery's silence, once filled with the rustle of parchment and the soft clink of glassware, had deepened. By the dawn of the 14th century, the quiet pursuit of alchemical understanding within monastic walls had grown too bold, too visible. The balance between spiritual inquiry and ecclesiastical orthodoxy tilted decisively, and many monastic alchemists found themselves caught in the crosswinds of change. What began as contemplation had, in the eyes of the church, become risk, and for some, even treason. The turning tide, from curiosity to condemnation. By the early 1300s, European society had begun to change at an accelerating pace. Trade increased, cities expanded, and the rise of universities fostered a class of secular scholars who competed with the church for intellectual authority. Alchemy, once cloaked in the folds of devotion, became increasingly associated with secular ambition. Its promise of gold attracted nobles, its promise of transformation attracted mystics, and its symbolic language began to blur into more dangerous territories: heretical sects, magical rites, and secret fraternities. The Church took note. In 1317, Pope John XXII issued the papal bull Spondent Quas non exhibent, they promise that which they do not deliver. It condemned fraudulent alchemists who claimed to transmute metals and sell counterfeit gold. While ostensibly aimed at charlatans, the edict sent a chilling message: alchemy had crossed a line. Even sincere practitioners within monasteries felt the weight of suspicion. The fate of Brother Gilles. Consider the case of Brother Gilles of Saint-Trémy, a Cistercian monk whose life survives in fragments from inquisitorial records. Gilles had spent decades in study, his surviving notebooks hidden beneath the wooden floorboards of his monastery, and discovered only in the 19th century, contained meticulously written procedures for distillation, purification, and crystallization. He made extensive use of symbolic diagrams, spirals, triangles, vessels with wings, and yet his writing was consistently framed in theological terms. He saw his work not as sorcery, but sanctification. Nonetheless, in 1329, Brother Gilles was summoned before the local bishop and charged with tampering with divine order. His fate is uncertain. Some records suggest he was exiled, others hint at a harsher punishment, but his case marked a shift. Where once the inquisitor sought heretics, now he looked also for alchemists. The art had become suspect. The hermit alchemist. With pressure mounting, some monastic alchemists chose solitude over persecution. By the mid-14th century, it was not uncommon for hermits and recluses to carry alchemical knowledge into the wild. These were often former monks, or apprentices of monastic apothecaries, who had fled into forested regions, abandoned towers, or cave-dwelling cells to continue their work in secret. One such figure, known only as Anselm the Quiet, was said to have lived in the ruins of a Roman watchtower near the Moselle River. Local folklore described him as a healer, a brewer of tinctures, and a maker of strange inks that shimmered in candlelight. His writings, preserved in a weather-stained volume found centuries later, contain both psalms and alchemical instructions layered in metaphors so thick that only a trained mind could untangle them. His tools simple: clay pots, copper pans, crude alembics made from wine bottles, nothing magical, nothing beyond reach. Yet his notes reveal a complex inner world where soul and substance were one. He died alone, his crucible still warm. Echoes in architecture. Even after monastic alchemy was suppressed, its remnants endured in unexpected places. In some monasteries, peculiar architectural features suggest the presence of concealed laboratories: narrow chimneys with no fireplaces, sealed-off cellars beneath infirmaries, and unusually thick doors in isolated corners of the abbey complex. Historians and archaeologists debate their function. Were they remnants of heating rooms for ink making, or distillation chambers? Could they have been used for producing tinctures, dyes, or even perfume? One such example exists at the ruins of the Abbey of Saint Genelay in Brittany. A narrow corridor ends in a room with blackened walls, 3 small ventilation shafts, and a basin carved into stone. No records explain its purpose. But nearby, buried beneath rubble, fragments of glass crucibles and scorched parchment were found. Not proof, perhaps, but evidence, traces of flame. The manuscripts that survived. Though many alchemical texts were lost, others were smuggled out of monasteries before destruction. Some found their way into private libraries, hidden within volumes of psalms or bound alongside medical treatises. Others were copied by hand, altered just enough to appear as mystical theology or natural philosophy. The Book of the 12 Gates, for example, attributed to the English alchemist George Ripley, contains prayers, symbolic diagrams, and extensive references to Christian imagery. Yet beneath its spiritual tone lies a complex guide to laboratory practice. Ripley himself was an Augustinian canon, educated in monastic tradition. His work, while more openly alchemical than earlier monastic writings, owes much to their coded style. He was one of many who inherited the legacy of silent monks who worked by firelight, spoke in symbols, and believed that nature itself was scripture. The decline of monastic alchemy. As the Renaissance dawned, monastic alchemy fell into obscurity. The new humanist spirit valued clarity, precision, and secular inquiry. Laboratories moved into cities. Alchemists once cloaked in spiritual humility became philosophers, physicians, or frauds. The monastic ethos of transformation through patience gave way to ambition and sometimes spectacle. The quiet monk gave way to the flamboyant court magician. And yet, something was lost in that transition. The monastic alchemists had sought not just to change metals, but to change the self. Their experiments were acts of devotion, their failures forms of prayer. When they watched lead blacken in the crucible, they saw sin. When gold shimmered at the rim, they glimpsed grace. Reflections from the present. Today, historians debate whether monastic alchemy was truly alchemy in the modern sense. The processes were primitive, the theories unscientific, and yet the monks preserved ancient knowledge through centuries of darkness. They tested, recorded, adapted. They believed, sometimes blindly, sometimes brilliantly, that the world was a book written by God, and every substance a letter in that text. We may scoff at their beliefs, but without them, the line from Greek natural philosophy to modern chemistry might have broken. They were the keepers of the flame. A final thought. As the centuries passed, many of the crucibles were shattered. The parchments decayed. The abbeys crumbled. But in forgotten drawers of European libraries beneath dust and neglect, their words remain. In quiet Latin, in broken symbols, in the margins of psalters. And so we ask, did they ever find what they sought? Was the gold they searched for hidden not in metals, but in meaning? And if so, did we lose something more precious than gold when the monastery doors finally closed? Story 2. Alchemy by Candlelight, Hildegard of Bingen's Medicinal Visions. The Rhine River curled quietly below the hill where the abbey stood, its waters dark and slow in the dusk. Winds swept across the valleys of the Rhineland, carrying with them the scent of pine, sage, and far-off smoke. From a distance, the abbey looked unremarkable, stone, steep roofs, modest in size. But within its walls lived a woman whose mind was anything but ordinary, a woman whose dreams blurred the line between vision and diagnosis, theology and transformation. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and though she would never have called herself an alchemist, the processes she practiced, both spiritual and medicinal, carried the unmistakable fingerprint of alchemical thought. A child of visions, Hildegard was born in 1098 in Bermersheim, a small village in what is now western Germany. From a young age, she experienced vivid visions pulsing, luminous images that she interpreted as divine revelations. Her parents, uncertain what to make of her sensitivity, sent her to live in a religious community at the Disibodenberg Monastery. Here she was enclosed with an older woman, Jutta of Sponheim, in a practice known as anchoress, living a form of spiritual isolation meant to cultivate holiness. It was in this silent, dim cell that Hildegard began to shape her inner world. These early visions were not merely symbolic, they often had precise detail. Glowing figures surrounded by stars, divine forces flowing through plants, and the inner workings of the human body as seen through the light of heaven. She believed herself not the author of these images, but a vessel, and from this sacred imagery she began to write. The Medicatrix, Healing with Earth and Spirit. Though Hildegard's theological works like Civias and Liber Divinorum Operum garnered attention during her lifetime, her lesser-known texts offer a very different kind of insight, a glimpse into a medical and natural worldview that closely resembled the alchemical paradigms developing elsewhere in medieval Europe. Her two most practical books, Physica and Causae et Curae, reveal a woman deeply engaged with the physical world, cataloging herbs, minerals, animal products, and their uses in medicine. She wrote not as a passive observer, but as someone who believed that God's wisdom was embedded in all things, and that healing involved recognizing how these substances mirrored divine order. In this sense, she acted much like the monastic alchemists of her day, not simply mixing ingredients, but interpreting them as part of a greater cosmological pattern. The doctrine of viriditas. At the center of Hildegard's healing philosophy was the concept of viriditas, a Latin term meaning greenness or greening power. But viriditas was more than just chlorophyll or growth. To Hildegard, it represented the divine life force within all living things. It was what made a plant grow, a body heal, or a soul renew itself. She believed illness arose when a person lost their balance with this natural force, when their humors, in line with Galenic medicine, became unaligned with the rhythms of creation. Viriditas could be restored through herbs, prayer, music, and natural remedies. The idea was strikingly alchemical, healing as transformation, balance through natural opposites, inner harmony mirrored in outer form. Herbalism and alchemical resonance. In Physica, Hildegard describes hundreds of plants, stones, and animals, often including both medicinal and spiritual uses. Her descriptions do not merely record the observable characteristics of a plant, they interpret its essence. For example, fennel was said to increase clarity of sight, both physically and spiritually. Rose soothed the heart and cooled the blood, useful not only in fevers but in emotional distress. Galangal, a warming root, was prescribed to invigorate a tired body and awaken sluggish spirits. In each entry, Hildegard combines observation with theological reflection. The plant is not just a substance, it is a message. Its form, taste, and effect are clues to its divine purpose. This symbolic interpretation of nature, reading it like a sacred text, echoes the allegorical mindset of alchemical thinkers across Europe and the Islamic world. Just as they saw sulfur and mercury as reflections of masculine and feminine forces in nature, Hildegard saw herbs as expressions of divine intention. A healing woman in a man's world. In a time when women's access to education and scholarly discourse was limited, Hildegard's work stands as a bold exception. Her reputation grew during her lifetime not just as a healer and visionary, but as an abbess, author, composer, and public speaker. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and theologians. She traveled widely. She preached. She even rebuked Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, for supporting an anti-pope. Yet her medical writings remained rooted in the daily needs of the body. She prescribed steam baths, dietary changes, salves, and charms. Her remedies were practical, her language direct. This was not magic. It was not superstition. It was grounded, empirical observation infused with theology and mysticism. Much like the early alchemists in monasteries, Hildegard operated on a belief that the physical and spiritual were inseparable. Healing one meant addressing both. Music, medicine, and vibration. Among Hildegard's most unusual contributions was her belief in the healing power of music. She composed dozens of liturgical songs, some of the most ethereal and haunting of the medieval period. But for Hildegard, music was not merely art. It was a form of spiritual medicine. The right tones could realign the body's harmony with divine order. Dis-ease, in this sense, was a kind of dissonance. This idea, healing through frequency, has echoes in later esoteric alchemical and hermetic traditions, where sound and vibration are believed to influence matter at a subtle level. While Hildegard did not conduct chemical experiments in the modern sense, Her integration of sensory experience, taste, scent, sound, texture into a coherent system of healing places her work within the same conceptual universe as medieval alchemy. The candlelit laboratory. Though she had no formal lab, Hildegard's abbey was a center of activity. Apprentices and sisters gathered herbs from the gardens. Oils were pressed, roots dried, poultices prepared. She likely supervised an infirmary, as most abbesses did, and her knowledge of diagnosis, anatomy, and symptomatology was far from abstract. She may have worked by candlelight, not unlike her monastic contemporaries. Her tools would have been familiar: mortar and pestle, copper pots, ceramic jars, glass flasks. Her texts often described preparation methods in detail: how to heat, how long to soak, when to strain. While she never used terms like solve et coagula, her procedures mirrored them. To break down, to purify, to rejoin. The rhythm of alchemical work is present in her methods, though always framed in the language of healing and grace. In her own words, "In Causa et Curi," she wrote, "The earth sweats out its juices, and in them is hidden fire. The soul has its fire too, by which it lives and perceives." This line, simple, almost poetic, captures the unity she saw between the elements and the self. The fire in the plant, the fire in the soul, the transformation of suffering through heat, through pressure, through time. These are the metaphors of alchemy, but to Hildegard, they were also truths of divine origin. Her legacy, lost, forgotten, revived. For centuries after her death in 1179, Hildegard's writings were copied, quoted, and used in monastic infirmaries. But as medical science turned towards secular empiricism, her symbolic language was gradually dismissed as superstition. Only in the late 20th century did her star rise again, first among feminists seeking historical role models, then among musicians, mystics, and scholars. Today, she is recognized as a doctor of the Church, an extraordinary title granted to only a handful of figures in Catholic history. Yet her work still resists easy classification. Was she a mystic, a healer, a proto-alchemist? Or all three? A final question. As we examine her life, we are left with a quiet question. How much of Hildegard's vision was metaphor, and how much was insight into a world modern science has yet to fully explain? When she saw light in the herbs, fire in the veins, harmony in sound, was she dreaming? Or was she simply perceiving nature at a depth we have forgotten how to see? Night in the abbey was quiet, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of beams cooling after the day's heat. Candles flickered in thick iron sconces. Within her chamber, Hildegard of Bingen bent over a parchment. Her hands, marked by time and tincture, moved slowly as she composed a text both medical and mystical. She did not think of her work as radical. To her, she was simply recording what God had shown her. But in truth, her writings bridged worlds: faith and science, matter and spirit, past and future. She was building not just a medical compendium, but something far stranger: an alchemical map of the cosmos embedded in the body. The microcosm and macrocosm, a body like the universe. Central to Hildegard's worldview was the belief in the interconnectedness of all creation. Humanity, she wrote, was a microcosm, a miniature reflection of the universe. The stars influenced health. The seasons shaped the body's inner rhythms. Even emotions were tied to planetary balance. This was not unique to her, but she expressed it with rare clarity. Her vision was not of a body isolated from nature, but entangled in it, what Galen hinted at, and what later alchemists like Paracelsus would proclaim more overtly. To treat illness, then, was not only to understand the body. One had to understand the pattern of the heavens. The firmament and the human body are of one construction, she wrote. As the firmament is arranged with stars, so is the head adorned with hair. This worldview, a body shaped by the stars, a soul stirred by earthly elements, is alchemical in structure. It reflects a cosmos alive with correspondences. In her writings, everything mirrored something else. Humor's heavens and hidden heat. Hildegard drew on the ancient doctrine of humoral theory, inherited from Greek medicine: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each tied to the four elements air, water, earth, fire. But she added her own interpretations. She believed that the balance of humors was not static, but fluctuated with the phases of the moon, the position of the sun, and the cycles of nature. She spoke of the body's inner warmth, not just physical heat, but a spiritual fire akin to the alchemist's furnace. This internal fire, if left untended, could lead to illness. It could be cooled by certain plants or awakened through song. It had to be respected. It is easy to see how this relates to alchemical theories of transformation. The idea that real change, required heat, both literal and symbolic. Whether it was metal or flesh, transformation was a matter of fire and time. Alchemical symbolism, in Hildegard's language. Although Hildegard never used the language of solve et coagula, the breaking down and recombination of elements central to alchemical theory, her writings abound in equivalent imagery. In her visions, the soul is sometimes a forge. Suffering, heat, and illness purify it. Herbs and remedies are not just healing agents, they are catalysts. The divine light which she saw in her visions is often depicted as a fire that tempers rather than consumes. Take her description of black bile. Black bile is heavy and cold, but when illuminated by the warmth of divine reason, it becomes fertile like tilled soil. In alchemical terms, this is nigredo, the blackening stage, the moment of putrefaction and despair that precedes enlightenment. It is the shadow through which the soul must pass before it can be transmuted. Recipes for transformation, remedies from Physica. Hildegard, Physica reads in part like a pharmacy, in part like scripture. She records recipes for ointments, tonics, and compresses. These remedies are precise measurements, preparation times, ingredients, but also steeped in a spiritual worldview. Here are a few examples. Hazelnuts, they bring wisdom to the brain. She recommends eating them with fennel to clear mental fog. Vervain, steeped in wine, it calms those who are troubled in soul. A plant used to cleanse both mind and body. Celery root, prescribed to those with sadness of the heart, her version of what we might now call depression. These are not random herbal remedies. They reflect a belief in the symbolic and functional properties of matter. The plant doesn't merely treat a symptom, it addresses the soul. The alchemist would have called this the signature of the substance, an idea that Paracelsus would later formalize in the doctrine of signatures. But Hildegard had intuited it centuries before. The role of stones and metals. Hildegard did not ignore minerals and stones in her healing work. While she did not conduct metallurgical experiments like later alchemists, she assigned spiritual energies to crystals and metals. In her section on stones in Physica, she discusses amethyst, said to bring calm and clarity. Sapphire, symbol of purity, used to treat fevers and eye ailments. Lead, dangerous, heavy, associated with melancholy and spiritual dullness. She described not only their physical properties but their temperaments, almost as if the stones themselves were personalities. This, again, mirrors the alchemical view that matter has hidden qualities, waiting to be activated by human will or divine grace. Dreams, vision, and divine instruction. The line between mystical vision and scientific insight was thin in Hildegard's world. She believed her knowledge came directly from God, not through study. Yet what she recorded was consistent, coherent, and remarkably complex. Modern scholars have speculated that her visions may have been the result of migraines or neurological conditions. But regardless of their source, what matters is how she interpreted them. In a world where women were discouraged from public speech or scholarly writing, Hildegard claimed a divine mandate. Her visions were her authority, and through them, she encoded a system of transformation, medicine, and healing that ran parallel to and at times ahead of the scientific currents of her time. She offered a different path. Not the university, not the lab, but the cloister and the candle, the garden and the soul. Spiritual alchemy without the name. There is no evidence that Hildegard read Arabic alchemical texts or studied the metallurgical traditions of her time. Yet, in a deeper sense, she lived an alchemical life. Her path was one of integration. She sought wholeness in a fragmented world. She healed with symbols as much as substances. She transmuted experience into wisdom and illness into understanding. When she saw a sick woman, she did not merely treat her cough or fever. She read her pulse, her sadness, her dreams. She saw the sickness in the soul and sought remedies not just in roots, but in scripture, song, and silence. This was alchemy in its oldest form, not about gold, but about transcendence. The hidden continuity. Many who followed in Hildegard's path, quiet herbalists, village midwives, convent healers, carried forward her insights without ever knowing her name. In medieval Europe, where literacy was rare, remedies and practices were passed orally. Her worldview seeped into the roots of rural healing and monastic care. Even when the Renaissance alchemists arose, drawing heavily on classical texts and Arabic sources, some of their principles echoed hers. That the world is alive with hidden forces. That transformation requires time, pressure, and balance. That healing is not a correction, but a restoration of harmony. These echoes remind us that alchemy was never just a laboratory pursuit. It was a way of seeing, a lens through which the mundane became sacred. Hildegard of Bingen was one of its clearest, if unintended, voices. A question in the quiet. As the candle gutters low and Hildegard sets down her pen, we're left wondering. Did she know how revolutionary her work would become? Or was she, like many alchemists before and after her, simply listening to plants, to light, to God, and writing down what the world had always been trying to say? The year was 1179. Hildegard of Bingen lay in her cell at the monastery of Rupertsberg. The candlelight danced on the stone walls, and her manuscripts, some still damp with fresh ink, rested on a nearby shelf. She had grown weak. Her final days were quiet, though the abbey still moved around her, its rhythms unchanged. But Hildegard had changed everything. She died that year, aged 81. Her visions, songs, and remedies would ripple through Europe long after her passing. Yet, as the abbey returned to routine, as ink dried and herbs were gathered in silence, a question loomed. Would her work be remembered? Or would it fade, like so many alchemical manuscripts, into the dust of forgotten shelves? The waning of influence. In the immediate years following her death, Hildegard's fame endured. Her letters were copied. Her songs were sung in other convents. Her theology, rich with cosmic symbolism and moral clarity, was referenced in sermons and mystical tracts. But her medical and alchemical writings followed a different path. By the 13th century, the rise of formal universities and a shift toward scholasticism and Aristotelian science recast how medical and philosophical knowledge was valued. The emerging academic world preferred the systematic over the intuitive, the quantitative over the symbolic. Hildegard's visionary language, dense with allegory and natural metaphor, no longer fit neatly within the evolving categories of science or theology. As a woman, her exclusion from the scholarly canon was nearly inevitable. Though many of her remedies continued to circulate in monastic pharmacies, her books were not integrated into the new intellectual order. Physica and Causae et Curae survived, but more in practice than in name. Herbalism without a herald. Across rural Europe, Hildegard's medicinal knowledge filtered into the folk practices of wise women, monastic infirmarers, and village healers. Her belief in the harmony of the humors, the fire of Viriditas, and the metaphysical properties of herbs became threads in a vast tapestry of healing that outlasted her name. Yet her worldview remained alive in the gestures of this tradition, in the tea brewed not only for digestion, but for lightness of spirit, in the baths drawn at lunar intervals, in the belief that the body's ills were echoes of imbalance in the world beyond it. This kind of practical alchemy, focused on restoring harmony between the body and the cosmos, became marginalized. It was never truly erased, but neither was it fully recognized. It moved in the shadows. Echoes in the Renaissance. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a new generation of alchemists, more openly experimental, more literary, more male, rose to prominence. Paracelsus, the Swiss-German physician and mystic, declared that healing required both spiritual and chemical insight. He challenged the medical orthodoxy of his time and described the body as a system of correspondences, very much in Hildegard's spirit. Paracelsus never mentioned Hildegard. He likely never read her. And yet their ideas balance through nature. Fire as purifier, matter as a bearer of divine force ran in parallel. This illustrates something essential. Hildegard was not isolated. She was part of an undercurrent of thought that persisted below the official histories. Her integration of vision, medicine, and nature anticipated the holistic movements of later centuries. Even when uncredited, her intellectual DNA lived on. Rediscovery and the rise of Hildegardian medicine. Centuries passed before Hildegard's works were brought back into the spotlight. In the 19th century, Benedictine scholars began publishing editions of her letters and theological writings. Her music was revived by choral societies, admired for its purity and complexity. But her medicinal texts remained obscure. Only in the late 20th century, amid a growing interest in herbalism, alternative medicine, and women's contributions to science, did her Physica and Causae et Curae begin to receive serious attention again. A movement emerged particularly in German-speaking countries called Hildegardian medicine. Practitioners attempted to recreate her remedies using modern ingredients. Clinics offered treatments inspired by her worldview. Some even marketed products with her name, turning her herbal theories into a commercial wellness trend. And yet this revival was uneven. Some praised it as a return to holistic thinking. Others criticized it as romanticism. Few engaged deeply with the alchemical underpinnings of her work, the sense that healing was not only about the body, but about a spiritual and elemental transformation. A feminine alchemy, forgotten and found. When we speak of medieval alchemy, we often conjure images of cloaked men hunched over alembics, muttering Latin incantations, surrounded by arcane instruments. The tradition is male-coded, dominated by names like Geber, Albertus Magnus, Raymond Lull, Paracelsus. But Hildegard's work forces us to ask, was there a feminine path to alchemy? Her tools were herbs and song, not gold and fire. Her transmutations were of the spirit and the self, not of metals. Yet the structure of her worldview, the belief that matter reflects divine order, that healing is transformation, that symbols unlock the essence of things, is deeply alchemical. She offered an embodied alchemy, grounded in the rhythms of nature, the intuition of dreams, and the wisdom of the body. In a world where most alchemical texts erased or excluded women, Hildegard's writings offer a rare countervoice. They suggest that the hidden history of alchemy may be broader, deeper, and more gendered than we have imagined. Hildegard's laboratory, reimagined. We may never find a laboratory bearing Hildegard's name. But imagine for a moment what hers might have looked like. A garden alive with scent lavender, hyssop, rose. A table with parchment strewn with stars and spirals. A mortar well-worn. A harp, its notes still resonating. Shelves of jars labeled in a neat, sure hand. A crucifix, a candle, a woman listening. To the earth, to her own pulse, to a voice that, in her telling, came not from herself but from something vast and luminous. She would not have said she was changing the world. She would have said she was following the divine script already written into creation. Lasting influence, quiet but enduring. Today, Hildegard is recognized as a saint, a doctor of the church, a composer, a theologian, a feminist icon. But she was also a thinker of matter, one who saw the world not just as creation, but as a dynamic field of spiritual chemistry. She died centuries before alchemy became chemistry, before women could attend medical schools, before the tools of modern science were invented. And yet she left behind instructions for transformation in body, spirit, and perception. She whispered, through herbs and visions, that the world is alive with meaning, if only we have the patience to look. One final reflection. As we close her story, one question still lingers in the candle-lit silence. Did Hildegard ever know that her jars, her roots, her stars, her visions would one day be studied not only as theology, but as a science of transformation? Or did she simply believe that in every plant, in every illness, in every soul, there was something sacred waiting to bloom if only touched by the right words, the right song, or the right flame? Story 3. The Hermetic Chain, How Texts Traveled from Alexandria to Toledo. In the dim corridors of history, behind wars and kingdoms and popes and emperors, lies a quieter chain of events, a movement not of armies, but of scrolls. Ink, rather than blood, charted this particular journey. It began, at least as far as our story goes, in Alexandria, a city of light, learning, and loss. And it found new voice centuries later in Toledo, nestled in the dusty heart of Al-Andalus, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims once shared not only walls but words. Between these two places, through deserts and monasteries and mosques, moved the texts of Hermetic wisdom, the foundations of medieval alchemy, philosophy, and natural science. This is the story of how ideas survived ruin, how fragments were reassembled, and how the dusty pages of antiquity were reborn in a different tongue, in a different world. Alexandria, the bright beginning. In the 3rd century BCE, the Library of Alexandria rose as the intellectual jewel of the Hellenistic world. Founded by Ptolemy I Soter, the library sought to gather all human knowledge, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Indian, Persian, under one roof. The librarians of Alexandria reportedly acquired books by any means necessary, buying, copying, even confiscating them from ships that passed through the harbor. Among the many traditions collected there was a set of texts attributed to the mythical figure Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth. These texts, known as the Hermetica, combined astrology, magic, medicine, and philosophy with spiritual teachings about the cosmos and the human soul. They were, in essence, the early bones of spiritual alchemy. But Alexandria's glory would not last. The fires came, wars came, and the books, so many of them, were lost. Yet the ideas within them refused to die. From scroll to sand, survival through translation. The fall of Alexandria was not one moment, but a slow collapse over centuries. Fires, purges, and cultural shifts all took their toll. And yet, many Hermetic and scientific texts escaped. They were copied often in Greek and moved eastward. The most important transition came during the 6th to 8th centuries, as the Islamic world began to collect and translate Greek scientific works. Centers of learning like Gundashapur in Persia and Baghdad's House of Wisdom became repositories of classical knowledge. Here the first major transmission occurred. Greek texts were translated into Syriac, then into Arabic. Among them were the treatises of Galen, Aristotle, and Plato, but also the more esoteric writings of the Hermetic corpus, including works on alchemy, astrology, and cosmology. The early Islamic philosophers, particularly those working in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate, preserved and expanded upon them. Thinkers such as Jabir ibn Hayyan Jeber, who synthesized Greek, Persian, and Arabic sources into a coherent alchemical theory. Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, who preserved philosophical and metaphysical components of Hermetic thought. The Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, who included Hermetic ideas in their encyclopedic work, blending science and spirituality. This was a golden chain of knowledge, and its links were languages. The role of the Arabic world in preserving alchemy. To understand how alchemy survived, one must understand the Islamic Golden Age. Between the 8th and 12th centuries, scholars across the Islamic world pursued knowledge not as a curiosity, but as a form of worship. To know the cosmos was to know God. Alchemy al-Ki Macron Miya Macron letter 2be was accepted as part of this pursuit. While some viewed it with suspicion, others like Jabir elevated it to a scientific and metaphysical system. His works, especially those dealing with the transmutation of metals, balance of elements, and the perfection of the soul, would influence alchemical theory for centuries to come. In Arabic, the language of science, Hermetic texts flourished. They were copied, annotated, and combined with Quranic cosmology. The sulfur-mercury theory, the development of laboratory apparatus, and the emphasis on purification mirrored older Greek ideas but were reframed with Islamic theology and methodology. These Arabic texts would become the intermediaries between the ancient world and the Latin West. But how did they travel? Toledo, a city of three faiths. By the 11th century, Toledo, in central Spain, became one of the most significant gateways for this transmission. Captured by Christian forces in 1085 but left largely intact, Toledo remained a city where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in close proximity. Its libraries filled with Arabic manuscripts were untouched. Latin-speaking scholars from across Europe came to Toledo, drawn by whispers of hidden knowledge. What they found were treasure troves of Arabic texts, philosophical, medical, astronomical, and alchemical. But the problem was language. Most Western scholars at the time did not read Arabic. They needed intermediaries. And so, an unprecedented project of collaborative translation began. The translators of Toledo. In the vaulted rooms of cathedrals and scriptoriums, translators worked side by side. Muslim scribes who read the Arabic texts, Jewish scholars who could interpret both Arabic and local Romance dialects, Christian monks who rendered the results into Latin. It was a cross-cultural collaboration, unique in its depth and intent. Some of the key figures included Gerard of Cremona, 1114–1187, an Italian who spent decades in Toledo translating over 70 works, including Ptolemy's Almagest and numerous alchemical and medical texts. John of Seville and Hugo of Santalla, translators of Arabic Hermetic and astrological treatises. Dominicus Gundisalinus, a collaborator with Jewish philosophers like Abraham ibn Daud, responsible for translating metaphysical texts, some of which bore strong Hermetic influence. These translators brought works into Latin that had never existed in the Western world: books on the philosopher's stone, the harmony of spheres, and the purification of matter and soul. What was transmitted? Among the translated works were the Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which became the cornerstone of Western alchemical thought. Its cryptic lines, as above, so below, were quoted for centuries. Pseudo-Aristotelian texts, such as The Secret of Secrets, blending medical, political, and alchemical wisdom. Jabirian corpus, under the Latinized name Geber, which introduced sulfur-mercury theory and detailed procedures for distillation, calcination, and sublimation. Many of these texts were ambiguous, layered in metaphor and coded language, but they planted seeds. Soon, Latin scholars began to write new works of alchemy, building on the foundation of the Arabic Hermetic tradition. Knowledge and its shadows. But there were tensions. The Church, while supportive of classical learning in many areas, grew uneasy with the occult overtones of some Hermetic works. Astrology, spirit invocation, and ideas of divine-like transformation were seen as potential heresy. As the 13th century progressed, inquisitors took interest in which texts were being read and why. Still, the chain of Hermetic knowledge continued. Books once burned in Alexandria were reborn in Baghdad, translated in Toledo, copied in Paris, practiced in Prague. The chain never truly broke, it only changed shape. A lingering mystery. And so we arrive at a question. How many of the texts we lost still survive in disguised form? How many theological treatises contain in their margins diagrams that echo the Emerald Tablet? How many prayers, recipes, and herbal texts hide a deeper metaphysical code? What was truly carried across the centuries? A theory of metals, a mystical religion, or perhaps a method of seeing an alchemical gaze that could look at lead or the soul and believe both could be made gold. The Latin texts were strange. They spoke of sulfur and mercury as more than elements. They described planets influencing the innards of men. They whispered of purification not only by fire, but by virtue. These were not the orderly, categorical books that scholastics favored. These were texts of transformation, cryptic, symbolic, rhythmic. And yet, by the middle of the 12th century, they were quietly circulating in European monastic libraries, cathedral schools, and among itinerant scholars. What emerged from the translation centers of Toledo, Seville, and other cities of Al-Andalus was more than a linguistic shift, it was a philosophical inheritance. An intellectual migration from east to west, wrapped in metaphor, preserved by careful hands, and mistranslated just enough to be reborn anew. Let us now examine how this alchemical chain begun in the shadows of Alexandria and refined in the laboratories of Baghdad was reshaped in the pens and minds of medieval Europe. Hermetic texts, from theology to technique. What made the Hermetica unique was its dual nature. On the one hand, the Corpus Hermeticum, a set of dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, was philosophical, addressing the nature of God, the cosmos, and the soul. These were deeply mystical and aligned with Neoplatonism, stressing ascent through knowledge, inner purification, and divine union. On the other hand, the technical Hermetica writings like the Emerald Tablet, the Book of the Secret of Creation, and various Jabirian treatises focused on practical methods. How to distill, how to extract essence, how to transform. European translators and readers rarely distinguished between the two. To the Latin mind, shaped by Christian theology and medieval metaphysics, these texts appeared as part prayer, part recipe, a manual for spiritual metallurgy. And so, the alchemical tradition that emerged in Europe was as much a religion of symbols as it was a science of matter. The Emerald Tablet, a brief but boundless text. Among all the Hermetic works translated in this period, none was more influential or more mysterious than the Emerald Tablet. Its Latin translation, Tabula Smaragdina, appeared in various forms beginning in the 12th century, often included in collections like the Picatrix or the works of Pseudo-Aristotle. It was short, barely a dozen lines, but those lines rippled through centuries of alchemical thought. The most famous line read, Quod est superius est sicut quod est inferius, et quod est inferius est sicut quod est superius. That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above. To medieval readers, this was more than metaphor. It was a cosmic key and articulation of universal correspondence. The planets shaped the body. The soul reflected the heavens. Metals carried moral meaning. Every process in nature dissolving, coagulating, calcining was echoed in the life of the spirit. This tablet was not merely read. It was meditated upon, painted into manuscripts, and invoked in rituals. For some, it was scripture. Gerard of Cremona and the bridge to the west. One man stands as a symbol of this great transition, Gerard of Cremona. Born in Italy in 1114, Gerard traveled to Toledo as a young man, frustrated by the lack of access to advanced scientific texts in Latin. Once in Spain, he devoted his life to translation. Over the course of decades, he rendered more than 70 Arabic works into Latin, including Ptolemy's Almagest, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, treatises on alchemy and minerals, works attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan. Gerard was not an alchemist himself, but his translations seeded alchemical thought across Europe. His versions were not always accurate. Terms like elixir, and elixir became confused. Processes were misinterpreted, but they allowed alchemical ideas to enter the Latin curriculum. Where once monasteries housed only hagiographies and psalters, they now kept volumes on furnaces, alembics, and tinctures. The role of Jewish translators. Behind many Christian translators stood Jewish intermediaries, men who bridged the linguistic gaps between Arabic, Latin, and the emerging Romance vernaculars. Figures like Abraham ibn Ezra and Judah ben Moses HaKohen played quiet but essential roles in this transmission. Often fluent in multiple languages, they worked behind the scenes to interpret not only words, but ideas. Jewish scholars had long maintained their own Hermetic traditions, integrating Kabbalistic mysticism with alchemical thought. To them, the transformation of base matter mirrored the spiritual refinement of the soul, tikkun, or repair. Thus, when they aided Christian translators, they sometimes introduced symbolic layers unnoticed by their collaborators. Through this silent partnership, concepts like the four elements, the quintessence, and astrological influence found stable footing in Latin Europe. The reception, caution, and curiosity. As Hermetic alchemical texts entered Latin libraries, reactions varied. Monks and theologians often approached them with suspicion. The symbolic language of transformation and divine ascent sounded dangerously close to heresy. Some alchemical treatises were condemned or censored, especially those containing astrological determinism or references to magical invocations. Natural philosophers, on the other hand, were intrigued. Thinkers like Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, and later Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas explored the newly available texts, cautiously looking for ways to reconcile them with Christian doctrine. Grosseteste saw the study of nature as a moral duty. Bacon believed in experimental verification and saw alchemy as a method to extend life and purify the soul. Albertus Magnus separated alchemy from superstition, trying to frame it as a legitimate part of natural philosophy. All were influenced directly or indirectly by the texts that had come through Toledo. A quiet revolution in the monastery. Back in monasteries across Europe, especially Benedictine and Cistercian houses, monks who had previously copied psalms now began copying alchemical recipes. Not openly, not loudly, but in the margins, in the codices of medicine, herbalism, and prayer. Alembics appeared in illustrations. Marginalia began to include symbols of the four elements or references to lunar cycles. Recipes began to list distillatio alongside orationis, distillation beside prayer. The process of inner transformation through silence, discipline, and fire fit perfectly within monastic ideals. The Hermetic texts, though foreign in origin, spoke a language monks understood well. The hidden power of mistranslation. Ironically, many of the key concepts that reached Europe were mistranslations, misunderstood metaphors, false etymologies, or distorted procedures. But these very mistakes often gave rise to new interpretations, new metaphors, new experiments. Take the term elixir. In Arabic, elixir referred to a transformative powder or essence. Latin translators rendered it as elixir vitae, and European alchemists took it as the mythical elixir of life. Thus, a misreading gave birth to a centuries-long quest for immortality. These shifts were not failures. They were part of the alchemical process itself: transformation through contact, renewal through misinterpretation. Just as lead might become gold, an Arabic parable became a Latin recipe, and an ancient philosophy became the seed of a medieval movement. A chain of fire unbroken. By the end of the 13th century, the Hermetic chain had extended itself across continents and centuries. What began in the temples of Egypt and scrolls of Alexandria had passed through the pens of Syriac scribes, the calligraphy of Baghdad philosophers, the voices of Andalusian translators, the scriptoria of Christian monks. Each step altered the text, each step preserved it. Alchemy, once a set of practices tied to Egyptian temples and Hellenistic cosmology, was now embedded in Christian Europe, filtered, transformed, but still burning with that same desire for divine unity through the mastery of matter. And yet one must wonder, in the quiet of a medieval abbey, where a monk might pore over an illuminated page by candlelight, did he ever realize the true origins of the words he copied? Did he sense that the Latin phrases he transcribed had once been Greek, then Arabic, then Persian? Did he know he was part of a chain of thinkers and translators, reaching back into a world that had vanished long before his abbey was built? Or did he simply feel deep in his contemplative soul that what he read was not just old, but eternal? The scrolls had been copied, the ideas had taken root. By the 14th century, the Hermetic texts, alchemical manuals, and cosmological visions that once lived in Alexandria's libraries and Baghdad's observatories were now folded into the intellectual life of Latin Christendom. The knowledge that passed through Toledo and other translation centers did not merely fill shelves, it shaped minds, quietly altering the direction of European thought. But like the alchemical transformation itself, this change was not sudden or showy. It was slow, patient, and often unnoticed. In this final section, we turn to the afterlife of the Hermetic chain, how it evolved, who carried it forward, and what traces remain today in the quiet corners of Europe's intellectual history. The rise of European alchemists. The 13th and 14th centuries saw the emergence of the first major Latin alchemists, writers, and practitioners, who now composed original texts rather than merely translating Arabic sources. Figures like Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar who believed that empirical study, including alchemy, was essential to understanding the natural world. Albertus Magnus, a Dominican who wrote extensively on minerals and the powers of natural substances, incorporating Hermetic thought into his Christian worldview. Pseudo-Geber, a Latin author writing under the Arabic name Geber to gain authority, whose works detailed distillation and metallurgical operations and became foundational texts for later chemistry. What distinguished these thinkers was their attempt to reconcile alchemical theory with Christian doctrine. The soul's transformation mirrored the refinement of metals. The inner fire of the spirit corresponded to the literal fire of the furnace, and the universe itself, as Hermetic philosophy suggested, was readable if one knew the language. That language was now Latin. The Christianization of Hermetic thought. With this shift in geography and language came a shift in framing. While Islamic Hermeticism had integrated the divine order with Quranic cosmology, Latin Hermeticism adapted to fit Christian metaphysics. The soul's ascent through the planetary spheres, so central in earlier texts, was now imagined through the lens of sin, redemption, and divine grace. Alchemical operations, calcination, dissolution, conjunction were often described as analogues for purgation of sin, mortification of the flesh, union with Christ. Even the philosopher's stone, once seen as a mystical substance, began to be interpreted by some as a Christological symbol. In some texts, Christ himself was likened to the stone rejected by the builders, later becoming the foundation of salvation. Alchemy became a spiritual allegory for the Christian path to perfection. This allowed alchemical texts to persist in Christian Europe, even under the watchful eye of the Church, so long as they were framed correctly. The role of the Codex, books as crucibles. The Codex, the bound book, became the new crucible. Within its pages, medieval scribes experimented with structure and secrecy. Many alchemical texts written in Latin after the 13th century bore no titles, no authors, and few clues to their origins. They were compilations, glosses, fragments pasted together from Arabic originals, oral tradition, and local experimentation. Some of the most famous medieval alchemical manuscripts include Aurora Consurgens, 14th century, a beautifully illuminated treatise attributed, perhaps falsely, to Thomas Aquinas, full of vivid allegories: sun and moon, king and queen, lions and dragons representing internal alchemical processes. Rosarium Philosophorum, a richly symbolic text that depicted the alchemical marriage of opposites and included illustrations of the transformation of soul and matter. Liber Hermetis, a Latinized version of Hermetic astrology texts that linked planetary influences with bodily humors and stages of life. These works were not read in haste. They were pored over, deciphered slowly, copied by hand, meditated upon. Alchemy had become not only a spiritual path, but a literary form, dense, symbolic, and deeply encoded. Laboratories in cloisters and courts. Though often secretive, some alchemical experimentation began to appear in more public settings. Monastic infirmaries, where healing remedies were prepared using distillation, fermentation, and mineral infusions. Cathedral schools, where marginal references to secret fire and quintessence appeared alongside teachings in theology and logic. Noble courts, where monarchs and patrons funded alchemists in hopes of gold, long life, or political power. In the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II tolerated and at times encouraged alchemical inquiry. In England, John of Rupecissa, a Franciscan friar, wrote about the aqua vitae, water of life, an early reference to distilled alcohol, which he believed held both medicinal and spiritual power. His works blended Hermetic themes with apocalyptic urgency, suggesting that God had revealed alchemy to the faithful as a way to survive the coming end of days. Thus, the Hermetic chain adapted yet again, this time, to the millenarian anxieties of late medieval Europe. Secrecy, symbols, and the hidden tradition. By the 15th century, alchemy had become a tradition of deliberate obscurity. Authors wrote under false names, often attributing their works to Hermes Trismegistus, Geber, or even Moses. They used symbolic diagrams, coded language, and allegorical imagery to conceal their meanings from the uninitiated. Why? Partly to protect their work from church censors and political authorities, but also because they believed that true knowledge must be earned through discipline, humility, and intuition. The language of alchemy was meant to mirror the process itself, slow, layered, mysterious. Only those willing to purify their own understanding, like base metal in the fire, could see clearly. This echoes the Hermetic ideal passed down from the East, that the path to knowledge is also the path to transformation. The Hermetic revival of the Renaissance. Though our story focuses on the medieval period, it's important to note that the Hermetic tradition did not end there. In the late 15th century, with the fall of Constantinople and the renewed interest in classical texts, scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola in Florence began translating Greek Hermetic writings, directly reclaiming them from Arabic intermediaries. Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463 reintroduced these ideas to Renaissance Europe not as curiosities, but as sources of ancient wisdom. Alchemy, astrology, magic, and Neoplatonism came rushing back into intellectual fashion. The Hermetic chain, which had survived fire and exile, now blazed again in the open air. But without the translators of Toledo, without the slow copying in dusty corners of monasteries, this revival might never have occurred. A final link in the chain. And so we return to the heart of our story, the unbroken transmission of knowledge from Alexandria to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Toledo, and from Toledo to every corner of medieval Europe. It was a transmission not only of words, but of ways of seeing. That matter holds mystery, that symbols speak truth, that the cosmos is a book waiting to be read, and that transformation of metals, of bodies, of souls is always possible. This chain was carried by scribes, scholars, mystics, and healers. It passed through the hands of the devout and the curious alike, and though many of its links have rusted or vanished, the pattern still endures. Sometimes it appears in unexpected places, a strange diagram in a 14th century psalter, a medical text with an anonymous recipe that references solar powder, a manuscript mislabeled as a herbal guide that, on closer inspection, reveals itself to be a roadmap to inner alchemy. One last question. When a monk in 13th century France copied out a page of the Secretum Secretorum, did he understand its Arabic roots? When a Jewish translator rendered a line about celestial influence into Latin, did he feel the weight of the ancient gods behind it? When a Christian scholar traced the spiral symbol of Mercury onto a vellum page, did he know he was connecting to a library burned 1,000 years before? Or were they all simply keeping the chain intact, one silent link at a time? Story 4. The Philosopher's Furnace, Albertus Magnus and the Spiritual Ford. The smell of warm ink hung in the air, heavy and metallic. Somewhere in the depths of the Dominican priory at Cologne, a man in his 60s, his hands stained from both soil and soot, was writing by candlelight. His table was cluttered with manuscripts, minerals, dried herbs, and crushed pigments. Behind him, a tiny furnace pulsed with a quiet heat. This man was Albertus Magnus, known to some as Dr. Universalis, to others as the last man to know everything. Albert was a man of paradox, a Dominican friar and natural philosopher, a rigorous theologian and experimental observer, a compiler of classical knowledge, and an original thinker in his own right. He would become one of the first medieval scholars to seriously engage with alchemy, not as superstition or heresy, but as a methodical inquiry into the nature of creation. And for him, the furnace, both literal and symbolic, was the path to understanding the divine. Who was Albertus Magnus? Albert was born around 1200, likely in Leungen, a town in present-day Bavaria. His early life is only faintly recorded, but by the 1220s he had entered the Dominican order, a relatively new mendicant movement emphasizing preaching, study, and poverty. He studied theology in Padua, then Paris, where he was deeply influenced by the newly reintroduced works of Aristotle texts that had been recently translated into Latin from Arabic sources, many via the translation schools of Spain. Albert's intellectual appetite was vast. He wrote about botany, zoology, astronomy, mineralogy, logic, music, medicine, theology, and alchemy. Over his lifetime, he would produce nearly 38 volumes of scientific and philosophical writings. But while many of his peers feared pagan philosophy or dismissed alchemy as dangerous mysticism, Albert did not flinch. Instead, he opened the books, lit the fire, and began to experiment. The integration of Aristotle and alchemy. Albertus Magnus's engagement with alchemy, can only be understood in the context of his commitment to Aristotelian natural philosophy. In Aristotle's view, all matter was composed of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and each had qualities of hot, cold, and wet, dry. These elements could be transformed by altering their qualities, and every substance had both matter, what it is made of, and form, its essential characteristics. This framework provided an intellectual justification for alchemy. If substances could be changed in form, then transmutation, the transformation of base metals into noble ones, was theoretically possible. Albert believed in the potential of such transformations, but he was no fool. He carefully distinguished between false alchemists, those who promised gold with no understanding, and those who sought to purify both material and spiritual realities through careful observation and moral refinement. To Albert, alchemy was both a craft and a contemplation. On minerals, metals, and the soul of things. One of Albert's key works on the natural world was his De Mineralibus, on minerals, which systematically cataloged the properties of stones and metals. In it, he described not only their physical traits but their behaviors under heat, their reactions in mixtures, and their symbolic resonance. He divided stones into categories: transparent and opaque, hard and soft, cold and fiery. Each mineral had a complexion, a concept borrowed from humoral theory, and a virtue, which hinted at its inner nature. Albert didn't merely record knowledge, he tested it. He heated, crushed, melted, mixed. He took notes. And while his experiments lacked the controls of modern chemistry, his goal was not only empirical, it was spiritual. He believed metals matured underground. That gold was not born but ripened from baser forms. That transformation was a process written into the design of nature, just as humans, through suffering and prayer, could become more perfect. In this, Albert echoed the Hermetic and alchemical tradition. The outer mirrored the inner. The role of the furnace, physical and spiritual. The furnace, a crucial tool in alchemical work, held special meaning for Albert. It was not merely a heat source. It was a symbol of purification, a place where the inner essence of things revealed itself under pressure. Albert described different types of furnaces and their uses. He detailed how to control heat levels and what vessels to use for distillation or calcination. But he also used the furnace metaphorically. He compared the spiritual journey of the Christian to a piece of metal placed into the fire. Just as lead must endure heat to become gold, the soul must endure trial to reach sanctity. This idea, so common in alchemical texts, found a place in his theology as well. He did not draw hard lines between science and salvation. For him, the two were intertwined. Understanding matter was one more path toward understanding God. Alchemy without heresy. Albert's defense of alchemy was, in part, a theological maneuver. At a time when many clerics were suspicious of occult sciences, Albert positioned alchemy as a legitimate extension of natural philosophy. He acknowledged that some used it deceitfully, but insisted that its true practitioners were those who sought truth, not gold. He argued that God had endowed creation with patterns and processes, and that studying these patterns was a form of reverence. In his writings, he explicitly rejected magic, necromancy, and superstition. He cautioned against shortcuts, and he warned that those who used alchemy for greed risked both spiritual and physical ruin. His alchemy was disciplined, Christian, and deeply intellectual. He laid the groundwork for others, especially his student, Thomas Aquinas, who would continue his efforts to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian doctrine, even if he never embraced alchemy himself. Legacy in the laboratories to come. Albert's influence extended beyond his own time. Though he died around 1280, his writings were copied and read for centuries. Renaissance alchemists, especially in the Germanic world, often invoked his name to lend credibility to their own experiments. Some even falsely attributed texts to him, hoping to benefit from his reputation. In this way, Albert became both a historical figure and a legendary one-part scholar, part myth. Some stories claimed he created a mechanical automaton, others that he built a philosopher's stone. These were fictions, but they point to something real. Albert was seen as a bridge between old and new, between faith and science, between metaphor and method. A man of soil, glass, and grace. To picture Albertus Magnus is to see a man with ink-stained fingers, turning pages of Aristotle and Avicenna, with earth under his nails, studying herbs in a Dominican garden, with ash on his robe, standing over a simple furnace, with prayer on his lips, as he considered the way sulfur and mercury danced in the flame. He was not trying to cheat the laws of nature. He was trying to understand them, to peer behind the veil, not through sorcery, but through patient, reverent study. A furnace of thought. Albert's real furnace wasn't made of clay or brick. It was his mind, a crucible into which texts, ideas, and observations were fed, heated by inquiry, distilled through prayer, and what emerged was not gold but a new way of knowing. He helped shape a generation of thinkers who saw no contradiction between studying the world and worshiping its creator. Alchemy, in his view, was not forbidden knowledge. It was a gift waiting to be refined like all things. A final reflection. When Albert watched a metal melt, or a stone crack under heat, or a vapor rise through a coil, did he see science? Or did he see something deeper? Did he sense that the very structure of matter whispered truths about grace, order, and the destiny of the soul? Was the furnace just a tool? Or was it, for him, a mirror reflecting the great work God performs in every heart that dares to be transformed? The cloister was not silent. It whispered with wind and footsteps and the murmur of Scripture. Yet somewhere behind those stone walls, a different kind of murmuring could be heard: the bubbling of flasks, the hiss of embers, the scrape of mortar against stone. For Albertus Magnus, the cloister was not just a place of worship. It was a place of observation, of construction, of careful experiment. It was, in many ways, his laboratory. He never claimed to turn lead into gold. He never promised immortality. But in the private corners of Dominican monasteries, Albert performed the quiet, methodical work of a man trying to decode the divine order written into matter. In this section, we explore how Albert practiced alchemy, what he believed it could offer, and how his legacy shaped the very definition of knowledge in the medieval world. Alchemy as Christian science. Albert's alchemical work was deeply rooted in a theological understanding of the universe. For him, creation was not random, it was structured, rational, and purposeful. Everything that existed, from the smallest stone to the movement of the stars, had its place in the divine order. He believed that God had endowed the natural world with hidden properties, and that studying these properties was not an act of pride, but of piety. This placed him in contrast with two extremes of his time. On one side, there were clerical critics who feared that alchemy bordered on magic, forbidden knowledge, or pagan superstition. On the other, there were charlatans and rogue alchemists who saw it as a shortcut to riches, power, or manipulation. Albert walked a careful path between them. He insisted that true alchemy must be rational, moral, and moderate. It must never aim to deceive, and it must always align with the greater glory of God. This moral framework allowed him to treat alchemy as a legitimate field of study, akin to medicine, astronomy, or geometry, so long as it was pursued with humility and reason. De Alchimia, the attributed works. The Latin manuscript De Alchimia on alchemy is traditionally attributed to Albertus Magnus, though scholars debate its true authorship. Whether written by him or a close student, it reflects ideas consistent with his known works. The text covers the 7 metals and their correspondence to celestial bodies. The philosopher's stone as both a material and spiritual ideal. Methods of distillation, sublimation, calcination. The need for ethical intent in pursuing transmutation. Here, the philosopher's stone, so often misunderstood as a literal object, is described more like an ideal form, a symbol of perfection and harmony. It is not simply the product of chemical reactions, but of spiritual alignment. This echoes earlier Hermetic teachings, as well as the Neoplatonic idea of ascent, that all things in the material world long to return to their pure, divine origin. Albert, whether or not he authored the text, certainly endorsed this framework. The seven metals and the seven heavens. One of the most enduring structures in medieval alchemy is the association between metals and planets, an idea Albert helped articulate in the Latin West. Planet, metal, quality, sun, sol, gold, perfect, incorruptible, moon, luna, silver, pure, reflective, mercury, mercury, changeable, elusive, Venus, copper, harmonious, beautiful, Mars, iron, strong, aggressive, Jupiter, tin, noble, expansive, Saturn, lead, heavy, slow, base. These correspondences were not mere superstition. For Albert, they reflected universal principles. The heavens influenced matter. The soul reflected the stars. The metals were not just physical, they had moral and symbolic identities. When the alchemist worked with lead, they weren't just melting metal. They were confronting melancholy, inertia, and sin. When they refined gold, they were glimpsing perfection, incorruptibility, and divine light. This moral alchemy, where outer actions mirrored inner transformations, would become a dominant theme in later esoteric traditions. The pursuit of the quintessence. Albert also played a role in transmitting the idea of the quintessence, the fifth element beyond earth, air, fire, and water. Sometimes called ether or spiritus mundi, the quintessence was thought to be the purest, most refined substance, the medium of celestial influence, the hidden force behind transformation. Albert's writings describe how the quintessence could be distilled from wine, herbs, or other materials, an early form of alcohol distillation. But more than just a chemical process, this was a philosophical act. To isolate the quintessence was to grasp the secret of life itself, the spark of God embedded in matter. This idea would echo through the Renaissance and into early modern chemistry, influencing Paracelsus and beyond. The ethics of experimentation. Albert's commitment to alchemy was always balanced by his concern for moral responsibility. He warned, "Many deceive and are deceived in this art because they seek gold, not understanding that the goal is truth." He believed that experimentation must be conducted with discipline, that one must not trust every book or recipe, that God had hidden the secrets of nature for a reason, and only the patient, the humble, and the faithful would glimpse them. This caution was critical in an age when accusations of heresy or sorcery could have fatal consequences. Albert modeled a safe path where one could study natural phenomena deeply without leaving the fold of orthodoxy. Between the garden and the crucible. Albertus Magnus was not confined to the furnace. He was also a botanist, a zoologist, and a careful observer of weather, soil, and stars. He saw no contradiction between the empirical and the spiritual. A leaf was not just a leaf. It had form, function, meaning. It was part of the grand tapestry of creation. A rock was not just a rock. It could be heated, split, examined, and perhaps even transformed. In this synthesis of observation and contemplation, Albert anticipated the later developments of both scientific method and Christian mysticism. His was a holistic alchemy, where prayer and fire were both tools of insight. The student who surpassed him. One of Albert's most famous students was Thomas Aquinas, who would go on to become perhaps the most influential theologian of the medieval period. Thomas respected alchemy, but approached it more cautiously than his teacher. He preferred the clarity of Aristotelian logic and was more concerned with metaphysical causes than material operations. Yet Aquinas's integration of faith and reason, of philosophy and theology, echoed the groundwork laid by Albert. And in his careful distinctions between natural magic, miracle, and alchemy, Aquinas helped ensure that Albert's vision of a rational and faithful pursuit of nature's secrets could continue without being branded heretical. The end of the alchemist friar. Albertus Magnus died around 1280. In his later years, legend says he returned to Cologne, where he taught, prayed, and perhaps even tended his garden. Some accounts suggest that he abandoned scholarly life for a time, seeking contemplation after decades of teaching and writing. But the books remained. His manuscripts circulated in abbeys and universities. His approach, rooted in respect for tradition, bold in inquiry, and cautious in speculation, became a model for Christian scholars trying to navigate the tensions of knowledge and belief. One more glance at the flame. The stories say that when Albert looked into a flame, he saw not only combustion but structure, a pattern in the chaos, a hierarchy in the heat. He saw what others missed, that even fire obeyed laws. For him, the furnace was never merely a tool for cooking metals. It was a lens through which the inner essence of matter and the intentions of its creator could be glimpsed. A closing question. As Albert extinguished his last furnace, or set down his quill after hours of cataloging stones and stars, did he feel he was any closer to the truth? Or did he simply believe that the seeking the refinement of questions, like metals, was itself the holy work? By the late 13th century, the world was shifting. The University of Paris had become the heartbeat of European intellectual life. Cities were swelling with craftsmen and clerics, and the medieval church was tightening its grip on doctrine and permissible inquiry. In this increasingly structured and regulated world, the fire Albertus Magnus had tended both in the crucible and in the classroom burned on, but under new constraints. Albert had died, but his writings survived. They moved quietly through Europe, copied in monasteries, shelved in cathedral libraries, sometimes hidden, sometimes flaunted, sometimes misunderstood. The alchemical ideas he had preserved and defended took on new life in the hands of those who would follow, men and women chasing knowledge, gold, or God. But with Albert gone, and the Inquisition on the rise, what became of his balanced vision of science and faith? This final section explores the aftermath of Albert's alchemical legacy, the myths that grew around his name, and the subtle yet profound impact he had on Western thought. A scholar becomes a legend. Albertus Magnus was canonized in 1931 and declared a doctor of the Church in 1932, more than 650 years after his death. But long before the Vatican formally recognized his contributions, legend had already overtaken history. Stories circulated that Albert had created a talking head, a mechanical automaton imbued with knowledge. Others said he had discovered the philosopher's stone, or that he built a magical garden in Cologne where plants bloomed year-round. None of these tales were true, yet they persisted. Why? Because Albert had engaged in disciplines that were on the threshold of the mystical and the scientific. He was a man of the mind, the monastery, and the mortar. To later generations who didn't understand the slow, meditative pace of scholastic experimentation, he seemed like a wizard. The truth was more complex and more interesting. Albert's influence stemmed not from sorcery, but from his unwavering belief that faith and reason could coexist, that creation could be studied without desecrating it, and that the path to knowledge was a form of devotion. the Albertine texts forged in his name. As Albert's fame grew, so did the number of spurious texts attributed to him. By the 14th and 15th centuries, dozens of manuscripts claimed his authorship. Many were clearly forgeries written by anonymous alchemists hoping to lend their ideas weight by invoking the respected name of Albertus Magnus. Some examples include Liber de Secretis Mulierum, Book of Women's Secrets, a text about reproduction and astrology falsely attributed to Albert but actually a later medieval work. Speculum Alchemiae, Mirror of Alchemy, an alchemical text claiming to explain the philosopher's stone, likely written in the 15th century. De Secretis Naturae, on the secrets of nature, a collection of recipes and natural wonders that borrow Albert's style, but not his caution or rigor. These pseudo-Albertine works were wildly popular. They blended natural philosophy, magic, astrology, and folk remedies, and they helped blur the lines between what Albert truly believed and what others projected onto him. Over time, Albert the scientist became Albert the sorcerer, at least in the popular imagination. A lasting method, observation and order. Despite the distortions, Albert's true legacy endured. His real contribution to alchemy was not the invention of secret formulas or mystical substances. It was the introduction of method, classification, and balance. He showed that alchemy could be structured, not chaotic. Experimentation could serve faith, not challenge it. Nature's secrets were not blasphemies, but gifts. In this, he helped pave the way for later thinkers like Roger Bacon, who pushed for empirical testing and observation; Thomas Aquinas, who integrated Aristotle into Christian theology; Ramon Llull, who saw symbolic logic as a path to divine truth; and eventually, centuries later, Paracelsus, who turned alchemy toward medicine; Robert Boyle, who helped shape modern chemistry; Isaac Newton, who spent nearly as much time studying alchemy as physics. Each, in some way, inherited Albert's quiet insistence that knowledge could be holy. The cinders of medieval alchemy. By the end of the 15th century, alchemy had become a literary tradition, an experimental craft, and a spiritual pursuit all at once. But it was also under increasing suspicion. The Church, wary of heresy and magical practices, began to investigate those who dealt too freely with arcane symbols or strange substances. The Inquisition, while never explicitly banning all alchemy, made it dangerous to be too open. Albert had avoided this fate in life. His orthodoxy protected him. But his legacy, tangled up in forged texts and half-truths, did not always enjoy the same immunity. Still, his model of reverent inquiry remained. Even in the shadows of inquisitorial fear, monks copied diagrams of retorts and crucibles in the margins of devotional texts. Infirmarers distilled spirits in monastery cellars. Natural philosophers continued to read both De Mineralibus and the Emerald Tablet, looking for harmony between matter and meaning. The philosopher's furnace had not gone cold, it had simply been hidden. The spiritual forge. Albert's spiritual metaphors lived on in the language of transformation. In theological texts, sermons, and mystical writings, the imagery of fire, crucibles, purification, and transmutation flourished. In mystic writings, the soul became a metal to be purified. In monastic practice, suffering was seen as calcination, the burning away of the ego. In convent herbalism, the healing of the body mirrored the distillation of vice into virtue. Even those who never opened an alchemical text unconsciously absorbed Albert's metaphors, his worldview, his reverent treatment of nature as a coded language of the divine. A quiet influence. Perhaps Albert's greatest legacy was his demonstration that the quest for understanding need not be a threat to faith. In an age when curiosity could be punished, Albert offered a model of intellectual devotion. He taught that inquiry is not the enemy of belief. The natural world is not a temptation, but a revelation. The transformation of matter can mirror the transformation of the soul. This worldview did not end with him. It whispered its way through convents and courts, through libraries and laboratories, through texts both canonical and apocryphal. It waited quietly beneath the surface of Western thought, ready to emerge in each new generation that dared to ask, what is this world made of? And what, in turn, am I made of? One final spark. Imagine for a moment the old friar in his study, his breath visible in the cold morning air, the furnace glowing gently behind him, a mineral fragment held in tweezers, a prayer on his lips. He is not seeking riches, he is not courting power. He is listening to flame, to stone, to silence, to the slow revelation of order in chaos. And as the substance in the crucible begins to shift, as its colors change and its fumes rise, he writes not as a magician, nor as a fool, but as a man of faith watching God speak through matter. A question to leave burning. If Albertus Magnus could walk into a modern laboratory, today gleaming, sterile, filled with instruments he could not name, would he be astonished? Or would he simply smile, nod at the microscope and say, yes, the fire is still warm? Story 5. Rain, Rust, and Retorts, the alchemical life of a wandering scholar. Imagine a figure trudging through the sodden countryside of 13th century France, boots caked in mud, a flask of vinegar wrapped in cloth, a satchel rattling with copper filings, glass vials, and a cracked mortar. He wears a scholar's robe, threadbare and patched. His hood droops low over his brow, rain dripping steadily down the edge. This was not a man of courtly favor, nor a monk sheltered by monastic stone. He was a peregrinus, a wandering scholar, equal parts cleric, healer, alchemist, and beggar. His university training had earned him literacy and knowledge. His lack of patronage had earned him nothing else. But in his satchel, among the cracked glass and smudged parchment, he carried something more than tools. He carried fire. Not literal flame, though sometimes, that too, but the symbolic fire of transformation. He believed, as so many others did in his time, that matter could change, and that so could he. In this section, we trace the life of one such alchemist, not a well-documented sage like Albertus Magnus, but a composite character drawn from real records, marginalia, and letters. The forgotten men who practiced alchemy on the move, in the shadows, at risk, and often in vain. The wandering scholar, neither here nor there. The 13th century was a time of paradox. Universities were emerging as centers of intellectual rigor. Paris, Bologna, Oxford all offered Latin instruction in theology, philosophy, and natural science. Yet many students, once trained, found themselves without benefices, without stable posts, and without homes. Some turned to teaching in rural schools. Others entered monasteries. But some, especially those drawn to the practical arts of medicine, astrology, and alchemy, became itinerants. They were known by many names: clerici vagantes, Goliards, or simply wandering scholars. Often viewed with suspicion, these men lived from hand to mouth, trading knowledge for food, healing for coin, or astrology for protection. Our wandering alchemist, let's call him Ferendus, after a common Latinized name, was one such man. He was neither entirely welcome in university towns, where official teachings forbade unauthorized alchemy, nor safe in rural villages, where suspicion of sorcery ran high. Yet he moved between both worlds, always walking the knife's edge between knowledge and danger. What he carried. Ferendus's possessions were few, but telling. Surviving inventories and references in inquisitorial records suggest that itinerant alchemists often carried a small iron crucible, sometimes cracked from use, vials of mercury, vinegar, or distilled spirits, stoppered with wax or cork, charcoal either carried or bought, used in makeshift furnaces. sheets of parchment covered in symbols, diagrams, and shorthand recipes. Occasionally, fragments of Arabic texts poorly copied, barely understood but revered. And always a book of hours or psalter, to pass as a pious man and avoid accusations. These were not men of elaborate laboratories. Ferendus conducted experiments in abandoned barns, beneath bridges, or even in graveside shrines when no one was watching. His furnace might have been nothing more than a small pit, banked with clay and fed with dry twigs and sheep dung. Yet in those crude setups, he boiled vinegar with iron shavings, hopping to create verdigris. He calcined bones to ash. He tried to isolate the white vapor that ancient texts promised would lead to silver. He did not expect to succeed quickly. The text said transformation took time, patience, and prayer. The recipes of desperation. Among the alchemical recipes, Ferendus copied were formulas not for gold, but for basic survival. To create ink from soot, wine, and gum, Arabic useful for selling charms or copying texts. To soften metal with heated vinegar, and alum useful for crafting crude surgical tools. To make elixirs from wine, honey, and herbs sold as medicines or aphrodisiacs. To create fake silver using tin, mercury, and powdered white lead, risky, illegal, and sometimes lethal. This was alchemy at the bottom of the ladder, not the high philosophy of Albertus Magnus, but the gritty tinkering of the desperate. Still, there was dignity in the work. Ferendus may have failed to change lead into gold, but he changed bread crusts into sustenance, suspicion into trust, and knowledge into brief shelter. Alchemy to him was not an esoteric art, it was a way to survive. Between belief and bluff. It was often hard to tell whether Ferendus believed in the recipes he followed, or simply hoped in them. He may have spoken of the philosopher's stone as a metaphor, or perhaps, after too many cold nights and failed experiments, he began to think of it as a literal salvation. Was it real? Perhaps not. But it felt real, because to believe that there was a secret somewhere in this broken world that could redeem even base matter was to believe that he himself might be redeemable. That hope, more than the gold, was what he carried from town to town. Encounters with suspicion. Not all his journeys ended well. Itinerant alchemists appear frequently in court and Inquisition records, not because they were heretics, but because they were suspicious. The combination of arcane tools, herbal knowledge, and outsider status made men like Ferendus easy targets. Accusations included fraud for promising cures or transmutations and failing to deliver, sedition for sowing unrest with astrological predictions, sorcery for drawing strange symbols or burning substances at night, poisoning when medicines caused illness or death. To avoid arrest, Ferendus likely used religious language, recited psalms, and aligned his work with natural philosophy, not magic. Still, in one village he might be hailed as a healer, in the next driven out as a devil. One chronicler from Champagne wrote of a vagrant philosopher who was tied to a cart and paraded through the village square with his books chained to his neck. The price of seeking transformation was often humiliation, a fire that burned on. And yet they persisted. Scholars like Ferendus kept walking, teaching, experimenting. They copied texts and left them in abbeys. They passed knowledge from hand to hand. They inspired the next generation, less afraid of mud and ash than they were of stagnation. The wandering alchemist became a symbol, later romanticized by poets and proto-scientists alike. A man who, though he owned nothing, carried within him the seed of all change. A last image. We leave Ferendus on a cold spring morning. He crouches under the eaves of a ruined chapel. His crucible is perched on 3 stones. Smoke coils upward as a few embers cling to life. He leans forward, eyes reflecting firelight. The rain has let up and the birds have begun to sing. He is watching. waiting, believing, perhaps, that today, just today, the lead in his cup might light, that the world, in all its dirt and shadow, might yet reveal a glimpse of its hidden order. A final thought for now. Was Ferrandus a fool, doomed to chase illusions through rain and rust? Or was he, in his own way, a philosopher, one who knew that the act of seeking transformation was itself a kind of alchemy? The road wound onward. Our wandering alchemist, Ferrandus, had crossed into the German-speaking regions of the Holy Roman Empire. His Latin remained intact, but now he picked up fragments of Middle High German enough to haggle with apothecaries, plead with town guards, or decipher street talk about traveling friars and forbidden books. This was not a journey toward riches or recognition. It was a meandering path through crumbling abbey towns, mountain passes, and border villages, a life sustained by barter, superstition, and flashes of hard-earned trust. His experiments, now refined by failure, had become more cautious. Less about transmuting gold, more about extracting something useful from the world. He was one of many, the recordless, the smoke breathers, the itinerant minds who kept fire smoldering beneath bridges and in forest shrines. This section dives deeper into the tactics, techniques, and social strategies that define the lives of such wandering alchemists, and explores the twilight space they occupied. Not heretics, not saints, not scientists, not charlatans, but something curiously and persistently in between. Alchemy as performance. When Ferrandus arrived in a new town, he did not lead with crucibles. He led with stories. He might speak of the time he had treated a nobleman's gout with distilled dew and powdered walnut bark, or describe a curious transformation he witnessed in Sicily. Brimstone hardened into a red paste that turned iron pale. These stories were tools, not lies exactly, but strategic exaggerations. They built anticipation, established aura, and most importantly ensured that he might not sleep outdoors. For alchemists like Ferrandus, alchemy was not just a practice, it was a performance. The vials, scrolls, and strange metal instruments were theatrical props that lent mystery to the mundane. A paste of vinegar and copper might be sold as a metal softener. A dried beetle and resin compound, burned over an open flame, might be described as a pest-averting charm. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But in each place, he had to read the local fears and fascinations, quickly playing the role of healer, philosopher, or holy man as the moment demanded. Healers, not goldmakers. Many of the most reliable services Ferrandus could offer were medical. The Church disapproved of overt alchemical transmutation but tolerated remedial knowledge, especially when cloaked in Galenic theory or framed as empirical experience. Common treatments he might offer included wound balms made of honey, resin, and myrrh, stomach tonics using gentian, wormwood, or even chalk, fumigants for fevers, using dried herbs and animal bones, poultices of boiled onion and garlic, pressed to swellings or boils. His alchemical background meant he could create these remedies with more precision, and often more sanitation than local herbwives or amateur healers. But this skill came at a price. If a patient worsened, he risked blame. If he cured someone quickly, he risked envy. His only protection was departure. Ferrandus rarely stayed longer than 10 days in any village. He learned to travel light, talk little, and leave no trace of fire behind. Teaching as currency. In university towns or near monasteries, Ferrandus sometimes encountered younger students, hungry for forbidden knowledge. To them, he was not a vagrant. He was an initiate, a man who had left the lecture hall for the crucible, who had lived the knowledge others merely quoted. He offered simplified translations of Arabic texts, usually garbled, but fascinating. Handwritten tables of planetary hours for distillation. Symbol keys, unlocking the meaning of alchemical glyphs like air, water, or fire. tips on safe calcination, or how not to poison oneself with arsenic fumes. In return, students gave him food, ink, or candle stubs, sometimes coin. This informal teaching kept Ferrandus alive and helped spread alchemical knowledge along unpredictable paths. Many later manuscripts bear marginalia that reflect the influence of these roadside philosophers. Some even signed their work Discipulus Ignoti Magistri, student of an unknown master. The hidden network. Though Ferrandus traveled alone, he was not isolated. A loose network of fellow wanderers existed: alchemists, astrologers, scribes, hedge priests who met in city outskirts, abandoned cloisters, or even roadside taverns. They shared safe towns and towns to avoid. Updated translations from Spain, where Islamic alchemical knowledge was leaking into Europe. Rumors of nobles interested in sponsoring experiments. Techniques for hiding tools during searches. Copies of texts like the Turba Philosophorum, Liber Mercuriae, or De Illuminibus et Salibus. This hidden network was unrecorded and informal, yet it functioned like an underground guild, preserving scraps of lost knowledge, spreading techniques across linguistic and political borders, and passing on warnings when fellow alchemists were arrested or executed. Alchemy by moonlight. Not all Ferrandus's work was public. At night, when the winds were low and no one prowled the outskirts, he would set up his rudimentary alembic beside a stream or in a collapsed watchtower. His process was simple but not crude. A broken glass globe heated over a dish of coals, a copper tray to collect condensate, a small codex open to a folded page marked with oil stains and marginal notes. He might distill rosewater or vinegar, or try to isolate oil of vitriol from green crystals found near an abandoned mine. There was no audience, no applause, just the crackle of fire, the slow drip of distillate, and the occasional hiss of steam. This was the real work, not the story, not the spectacle, but the patient interaction with matter. Alchemy here was almost devotional. Wandering and the weathered soul. Ferrandus aged quickly. Records of such men often show them breaking down in their 40s, rheumatic, half-blind from smoke, their fingers stiff from frost and mercury. But within them, a strange calmness often emerged, a philosophy of resilience. Because when you walk for months without praise, when you chase transformations that never quite happen, when you watch noble ideas reduced to ash by weather, ignorance, or hunger, you learn to find meaning not in gold, but in the search. Ferrandus would never publish a treatise. He would never find a patron, but his influence would pass into hands unseen. Through one copied diagram, one shared formula, one repaired furnace. A final nightfall. Near the city of Speyer, Ferrandus may have died. There's a report of an unnamed alchemist of Peregrinus found lifeless near a wayside shrine, his satchel burned from within. Whether the fire was alchemical or accidental, no one knows. His body was buried in unconsecrated ground. His tools were confiscated. But years later, a friar in the same region claimed to have learned the art of distillation from a man of fire, who lived among ruins and spoke to copper as if it listened. The fire, it seems, had not gone out. An open thought. We remember the kings and the great philosophers, but what of the wanderers, the tinkerers, the anonymous hands who passed fire from cave to cloister? If they failed to turn lead into gold, but succeeded in keeping the dream of transformation alive, did they not still win? The crucible is cracked. The fire is low. The man is gone, but the trace of his breath still lingers in the soot. Memory in margins. Long after Ferrandus vanished from the roads and rivers of Central Europe, faint signs of his existence continued to surface not in ledgers or chronicles, but in the margins of manuscripts. A copy of the Secreta Alchemiae, stored at the Heidelberg Library, contains a scribbled annotation in the lower corner of a folio. From the man of the roads, who taught me of rain and fire. Elsewhere, a psalter in Latin contains strange additions on the inside back cover, hexagrams, a table of lunar hours, and a crude drawing of a distillation apparatus. These fragments are not definitive. They offer no biography, no confession, no closure. And yet they suggest something profound, that Ferendus's journey left an imprint, not in monuments, but in moments intellectual, spiritual, and practical that lived on beyond his death. The humble legacy of wandering alchemy. Unlike the grand treatises of monastic alchemists or the codified experiments of Renaissance natural philosophers, the knowledge passed on by wandering alchemists was fragmentary, often copied by memory or reconstructed in exile. Hybrid, mixing Latin with vernacular languages, Christian symbology with Arabic terminology, folklore with laboratory notes. Coded, not to hide secrets, but because their authors often lacked full understanding themselves. Adaptable, crafted to survive in motion in the dirt, in hiding. This diffuse, messy knowledge mocked by some historians was crucial in ensuring that alchemy never became static. Because it lived among those who traveled, it evolved. Because it survived in the shadows, it endured. And because it touched ordinary lives, healers, scribes, hedge priests, it became part of Europe's subterranean intellectual current. What the crucible teaches. The crucible symbol of alchemy is a vessel designed not for preservation, but for transformation through destruction. It must crack. It must blacken. Its contents must suffer fire, collapse, and reconstitution. So too with Ferendus's life. Each failed transmutation. Each burned manuscript. Each exile, each loss, each humiliation was part of the larger pattern of a man being transformed, shaped not into gold, but into something humbler, more durable, more teachable. We often think of alchemy as the pursuit of perfection, but the wandering alchemist teaches us that it is also the embrace of imperfection, a way of saying, even in ruin, something may still arise. Echoes in early science. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Europe was awakening to new intellectual movements, humanism, print culture, and empirical science. Figures like Paracelsus himself, an itinerant physician, began drawing directly from the traditions of wandering alchemists. Paracelsus famously rejected the formal scholasticism of universities, claiming instead, "I have learned more from the signs written on the body of the poor than from the halls of learned men." He carried a sword filled with alchemical substances. He brewed cures with sulfur and mercury, and he taught that healing and transformation must begin not in lofty towers, but in the muddy realities of life. Sound familiar? The influence of Ferendus and countless others like him echoes here. Their approach, unrefined and impure, paved the way for a version of science that valued experiment over theory, experience over authority, and movement over stasis. A symbolic afterlife. In Renaissance alchemical texts, a recurring image appears. A solitary figure walks a winding path through mountains. On his back is a sack filled with symbols. Before him, the sun rises through clouds shaped like a lion and an eagle. This image, known as the journey of the adept, is sometimes interpreted as a metaphor for the alchemist's inner path toward enlightenment. But it may also be a memory of real men like Ferendus, who walked from abbey to abbey, from town to town, seeking not fame, not riches, but a glimpse of order in a disordered world. They may have died unknown, but in this symbol they live. A final campfire. Let us return one last time to the fire. It is dusk, perhaps near Mainz or Metz. Ferendus, older now, bent at the shoulder, has set his crucible again upon 3 stones. The wood smokes, wet from yesterday's rain. The copper he placed inside is dull, unmoved. He does not sigh, he does not curse, he merely watches, because he knows the fire changes more than what it touches. It changes him. And in that transformation, though slow, though painful, though unfinished, he has already succeeded. Final reflection. We are often taught that history belongs to the victors, the kings, the named. But what if some of its most persistent currents were carried not by armies, nor by popes, but by wanderers in the rain, who bent over flames in silence and carried the dream of transformation across a broken continent? What if in the cracked crucible we find not failure but faith? Not in gold, not in perfection, but in the quiet belief that even the base can change. Story 6. The Merchant and the Mercurial. Alchemy in Islamic Spain's border markets. Picture a crowded market in 11th century Toledo, where the languages of Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew bounce off tiled domes and stone arcades. The scent of cinnamon and cardamom hangs thick in the air. Bronze scales tip back and forth as merchants haggle over bolts of silk, sheep fat, and wine from the northern hills. In a shady alcove between a glass cellar and a perfumer, a short man in a pale jalaba opens a wooden box. Inside, a pale yellow powder, a bottle sealed with wax, and a tiny scrap of parchment. He calls it Alem letter 2BFDN, Alaru Macron letter 1E25A Macron Ni Macron, the spiritual metal. No one quite knows what it does. Some say it heals wounds. Some say it makes silver weep. Others say it's poison, but it sells. In this section, we explore the often overlooked role of border merchants in Al-Andalus Muslim-ruled Spain, and how they became unwitting alchemists, translators, and transmitters of both material and spiritual knowledge. Al-Andalus, a fertile border. Between the 8th and 15th centuries, parts of the Iberian Peninsula were under Islamic rule. Known as Al-Andalus, this territory became a vibrant frontier both culturally and intellectually. Cities like Cordoba, Toledo, and Seville hosted libraries, scholars, and schools. Latin-speaking Christians, Arabic-speaking Muslims, and Hebrew-speaking Jews coexisted uneasily but productively, especially in commercial centers. Here, alchemy was not confined to elite scholars. It seeped into the border markets, places where goods met ideas and substances met interpretations. Toledo, in particular, was a crossroads. After its conquest by Christian forces in 1085, it became a translation hub where Arabic alchemical treatises were rendered into Latin. But even before this, the market itself was a laboratory. The merchant as alchemist. Unlike cloistered scholars who treated alchemy as a divine art, border merchants approached it as a product line. They sold distilled rosewater labeled as purifying essence, sulfur, alum, and saltpeter, bundled in packets for treating leather or for more arcane uses, colored minerals like cinnabar, mercuric sulfide, used as pigment or smuggled to seekers of transformation. Books and scrolls, often fragmentary, containing symbols and recipes in overlapping languages. One merchant, whose inventory survives in a Geniza fragment from Cairo, recorded the sale of letter 1E25 a J a R al letter 1E25 IKM, the stone of wisdom, for the price of a good donkey. Most merchants didn't understand the texts they sold, but they knew how to make them desirable. In doing so, they played a critical role. They moved alchemy from the elite to the commoner and made it mobile. Alchemical vocabulary in the market. A curious byproduct of this exchange was linguistic blending. Arabic terms were often Latinized or Hebraized in odd ways. For example, elixir right arrow elixir, originally referring to a transformative powder, it became generalized to any medicinal solution. Zebak mercury, right arrow azug in Spanish. Kibrit sulfur, right arrow quebracho, when linked to certain tree resins. In a letter 1E60 Ru macron in sodium carbonate, right arrow natron or nitrato, used both in embalming and as an alchemical base. These terms were passed down through shop talk, scribbled notes, and backroom deals. The result was a popular vocabulary of transformation, available to anyone with a few coins and curiosity. Caution and curiosity. Not everyone was impressed. Some religious authorities, both Muslim and Christian, warned against dabbling in matters of the unseen. They accused merchant alchemists of promoting sorcery, spreading heresy, or selling harmful substances under noble names. But others saw value in the art. One Andalusi herbalist, writing in 1093, praised the new curiosity among shopkeepers, who read not only lists of spices but books of celestial influence. And some buyers came specifically looking for alchemical goods not for gold, but for healing, cosmetics, or ritual purposes. A Christian widow might buy green vitriol to make her laundry whiter. A Jewish scribe might use lead tin compound to prepare writing surfaces. A Muslim potter might test mercury solutions to alter glaze colors. Alchemy was becoming entangled in daily life. Stories around the powder. Every merchant had a story. One powder, said to have come from a Greek fire maker in Alexandria, was said to ignite cold water when stirred. It didn't. Another bottle, marked with a scorpion symbol, was sold with the tale that its vapors could make men dream of lions. Probably just alcohol. A sealed tin vial was whispered to contain the breath of the moon, caught on a mountaintop in Syria. Did buyers believe these tales? Not always. But like modern branding, the mystique was part of the product. And in many cases, something real did happen when you burned, boiled, or mixed the substance. Even if you couldn't explain it, the powder did something. The transmission of text. Perhaps most significantly, merchants helped move texts often without knowing their full contents. They sold translated versions of Jabir ibn Hayyan's writings, though most were forgeries. Fragments of Zosimos of Panopolis, copied by scribes in North Africa. Practical manuals on distillation and sublimation, shared between Jewish and Muslim apothecaries. Annotated versions of Hermetic works, sometimes passed off as ancient Roman. The famous Toledo school of translators depended not just on scholars, but on the movement of these books through informal channels. Many Latin alchemical traditions of the 12th and 13th centuries can trace their roots to merchants who smuggled, copied, or resold Arabic manuscripts, sometimes wrapping them in spice cloths to disguise them as mundane goods. The alchemy of trade. In the end, the true alchemy in Toledo's markets was not always in the crucible. It was in the transformation of knowledge into commodity, of ideas into objects, of mystery into merchantable substance. Through the hands of semi-literate traders and curious buyers, alchemy became democratized, messy, and mobile. And in that mess, something new was born. Not the philosopher's stone, not immortality, but the foundations of chemical culture that would shape Europe for centuries. Unresolved reflection. If a merchant sells a vial, he doesn't understand yet that vial carries an idea across centuries. Does he count as an alchemist, or just an accidental philosopher? The market closes. The clamor fades into the stone alleys of Toledo. But behind closed wooden doors, the real exchanges begin. In back rooms thick with incense and whispers, merchants sit cross-legged beside visitors in monastic robes, Hebrew scribes with ink-stained fingers, and travelers cloaked in the dust of long roads. Candles gutter low. Scrolls are unrolled. Bottles are uncorked. Something is being bartered, not just goods, but knowledge. In this section, we venture deeper into how Al-Andalus's merchant class acted as informal custodians and couriers of alchemical knowledge, and how the blending of cultures, faiths, and economies in Iberia gave rise to a unique alchemical synthesis, one that would ripple far beyond its borders. From spices to symbols, the market as manuscript library. Most formal libraries of the Islamic Golden Age were attached to mosques, courts, or elite scholars. But in cities like Toledo, Granada, and Murcia, books flowed through far less formal hands. Merchants bought manuscripts from travelers and pilgrims, especially those arriving from North Africa, Sicily, and Egypt. Copied popular texts, often fragmentarily, onto cheaper materials, papyrus scraps, animal skins, even reused shipping parchment. Hired Jewish scribes, who had extensive training in copying religious and scientific texts, to replicate technical manuals. Smuggled scrolls across newly drawn Christian-Muslim borders after reconquests, hiding them in crates beneath dried figs and cloth. Thus, a book by an alchemist like Al-Razi or Maslama al-Imajri Macron letter 1E6di Macron might reach Christian translators not by formal commission, but through the hands of a seller of vinegar and ink. It is ironic, then, that some of the most treasured intellectual seeds of European alchemy were first passed like smuggled herbs. The practical books, distillation, dyeing, and diagnosis. Not all texts traded in the market were mystical. Many were practical manuals, used in daily life by tanners, perfumers, healers, and metalworkers. These included instructions for distilling rosewater, a major Andalusi export, extracting alcohol from fermented dates, creating universal ink from soot, honey, and vinegar, testing purity of metals through fire-based assays, dyeing cloth with madder root, alum, and other reagents. Over time, these manuals became hybrid documents. A recipe might begin in Arabic, switch mid-paragraph to Castilian notations, and end with a Hebrew marginal comment. These books were living tools, updated as new knowledge arrived via trade or experimentation. They were not static tomes of divine revelation. They were flexible, flawed, and utterly vital. Jewish middlemen and the craft of translation. Among the key figures in this transmission were Jewish intellectuals, especially in cities with established Sephardic communities. They often served as interpreters, fluent in Arabic and the Romance dialects emerging in Christian kingdoms. Scribes trained in calligraphy, textual preservation, and marginal annotation. Collectors able to travel between Muslim and Christian territories with relative freedom. Translators, not just of words but of symbols, cosmologies, and technical logic. Some Jewish alchemists worked closely with Christian scholars, such as Raymond of Toledo, in producing the first Latin versions of Arabic texts like De Illuminibus et Salibus. Others maintained secret notebooks, blending Kabbalistic diagrams with planetary alchemical systems inherited from earlier Islamic sources. To them, alchemy was not only chemical but also numerological, symbolic, and spiritual. The alphabet itself could transmute, they believed, if understood correctly. When gold was not the goal. We often think of alchemy as the pursuit of gold. But in the markets of Al-Andalus, alchemy was rarely about transmuting lead. It was about improving olive oil shelf life via heat treatments, making affordable glass glazes using silica and sodium ash, increasing fertility of dry soils by adding sulfur compounds, disguising bad wine with colorants made from fig sap and copper, healing ulcers or infections using compounds extracted from mercury or vinegar. For a border merchant, success wasn't gold, it was repeat business. Alchemy then became a tool of survival and competition, a way to improve goods and outdo rivals. Its esoteric symbols hid very practical ambitions. Ritual and secrecy. Despite its commercial spread, alchemy retained its aura of secrecy. Some scrolls were wrapped in 7 layers of cloth, mirroring the 7 planetary metals. Others were marked with warnings, He who reads without purification shall invite ruin. Recipes sometimes omitted key ingredients or replaced them with symbolic stand-ins. For earth, for water, for fire, for air, for salt, for iron, for sulfur. These glyphs traveled with the scrolls printed, etched, or hand-drawn. They were both encryption and invitation. A merchant might not understand what plus over fire truly produced, but he knew someone would pay to find out. Commerce as catalyst. As borders shifted, especially during the Christian Reconquista, some merchants became accidental diplomats. To maintain trade across political lines, they brokered not only goods, but access to knowledge. One document from 12th century Burgos records a Christian merchant who purchased a book of spirits and salts in Cordoba and gifted it to a Castilian noble. That book, likely a garbled translation of alchemical aphorisms, sparked interest in a monastic copying project that would later yield Speculum Alchemiae, a key Latin alchemical work. Again, the transformation didn't begin in a cathedral. It began at a spice stall. The alchemical marketplace mindset, the blending of commerce and esoterica, shaped a peculiar mindset among market alchemists and their buyers. Belief that everything could be improved, altered, perfected. Faith in material processes as spiritual metaphors, distillation, as purification of the soul. Willingness to mix traditions, borrowing freely from Muslim, Christian, and Jewish frameworks. Comfort with ambiguity, accepting that not every vial, recipe, or scroll would yield clarity. This mindset prefigured later developments in both alchemy and science. It encouraged trial and error, respected symbols, and demanded curiosity over orthodoxy. A candle in the cellar. Imagine one final scene. A 13th century merchant sits alone in a stone cellar beneath a workshop in Valencia. Before him, 3 broken vials, a stained page, and a bowl of thick black powder. The text says it should shine like the moon under heat, but it doesn't. Still, he keeps the candle lit. Still, he waits. In that waiting, we glimpse something deeper than trade. We glimpse a longing to transform, whether copper, self, or soul. Open question. When the marketplace sells not only goods but possibilities, and when those possibilities travel across cultures and centuries, do the merchants become alchemists? Or has commerce always been a kind of alchemy? The merchant is gone. The markets have quieted. The scrolls many burned, lost, or buried beneath dust have grown brittle with time. But the ideas endure. In this final section, we trace how the alchemy of the Andalusi merchant, born in the noise of border markets, in the hands of scribes and sellers, migrated into the intellectual bloodstream of Europe. We'll explore how trade became transmission, and how what was once whispered in cramped shops came to echo through universities, laboratories, and ultimately, the foundations of modern chemistry. After the markets, Toledo's twilight. Following the Christian reconquest of Toledo in 1085, the city transformed from a Muslim intellectual capital to a Christian center of translation. But the transformation wasn't abrupt, it was osmotic. Christian rulers did not destroy the city's libraries, they repurposed them. Muslim scribes remained, some converting, others quietly continuing their craft under Christian rule. Jewish scholars retained their access and stepped into critical roles as cultural translators. Here, a new class emerged, the learned merchant, fluent in the old secrets and the new demands. Men who once sold perfume and lead began guiding monks through manuscripts about sublimation and sulfur. The market-born alchemy of Al-Andalus became book-born science, still laced with mystery, but increasingly codified, structured, and documented. The path of transmission. Let us follow one thread, symbolic but grounded. A Jewish merchant in Cordoba in 1070 sells a scroll containing an Arabic distillation diagram, to a traveling Christian pilgrim. That pilgrim brings it to Leon, where it is left in a monastery. A scribe, curious about its drawings, copies it badly. That copy, slightly garbled, finds its way to Paris. There, a scholar named Gerard of Cremona, translating texts from Arabic into Latin, references a diagram that matches the merchant's scroll. The diagram ends up in a 13th century manuscript on aqua vitae, the water of life. That text influences Arnaud de Villanova, an alchemist physician who writes extensively on medical distillation. His student carries it to Montpellier, where it influences early apothecaries. One of those students writes a recipe for spirit-based medicine, which is later cited by Paracelsus in the 16th century. From stall, to scroll, to scholar, to science, this is how the market knowledge of Al-Andalus seeded Western alchemical traditions. The Muslim contribution in Christian hands. Many Islamic alchemists such as Jabir ibn Hayyan, Al-Razi, and Maslama al-Mjri Macron letter 1E6di Macron never set foot in Christian lands. Yet their texts, smuggled and sold by merchants and scribes, became core pillars of Latin alchemical education. Some of their ideas included the notion of chemical processes mirroring spiritual purification, the idea of elixirs as intermediaries in transformation, the use of sublimation, calcination, and distillation as both practical and mystical processes, classifications of metals and minerals by planetary and elemental correspondences. Even the word alchemy itself derived from the Arabic al-Ki Macron Miya Macron letter 2be, entered European language through this route. It wasn't merely the knowledge that crossed borders, it was the lens through which matter and meaning were seen. The evolving image of the alchemist. Before the Andalusi influence, many Christian thinkers viewed alchemy with suspicion, associating it with Eastern mysticism, heresy, or fraud. But as alchemical texts spread via merchant routes and were reframed by translators, the image of the alchemist changed. From sorcerer to seeker, from market swindler to natural philosopher, from outsider to innovator. Still, the roots of this image were not forgotten. Many Latin manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries continued to reference Toledo as a place of secret knowledge, Arab merchants as vessels of esoteric wisdom, Jewish translators as the preservers of forgotten arts. Even as the institutions of learning absorbed the content, they often disdained the carriers of that knowledge. This paradox, reliance on the marginalized while rejecting them socially, would persist throughout the history of science. Spiritual underpinnings, Kabbalah, Sufism, and Christian mysticism. Alchemy in Iberia was never purely practical. It was always tinged with spiritual undertones, drawn from the mystical traditions of its three major religions. Sufi alchemists saw the transmutation of metals as a mirror of the purification of the soul. Kabbalistic traditions employed gematria and symbolic language to align Hebrew letters with metals and cosmic forces. Christian mystics, influenced by these ideas, began seeing the magnum opus, the great work, as a form of divine imitation, turning the human into something radiant and eternal. In this way, the marketplace knowledge did not dilute mysticism, it diffused it. Alchemy in this world was not just about making gold. It was about becoming worthy of gold. The end of Al-Andalus and what remained. By the late 15th century, the Reconquista had completed its sweep. Granada fell in 1492, the same year Spain expelled its Jews and funded Columbus's westward voyage. Mosques became churches, libraries were burned, markets changed hands. But the knowledge did not vanish. Fragments of merchant alchemy survived in the notebooks of Renaissance physicians, many citing Arabic terms with mangled spelling. trade manuals that included alchemical recipes under sections for dyes, waxes, and textiles, superstitions and proverbs where alchemy lived on as metaphor. Don't trust the gold of Cordoba, a warning against illusions. The laboratories of early chemists, who unknowingly traced their techniques to scrolls once unrolled by candlelight in an Andalusi shop. And so, the fires lit in the markets continued to burn. Closing reflection. History tends to memorialize institutions, monasteries, universities, courts. But sometimes, the most lasting transformations begin in unlikely places. A narrow stall in Toledo, where a man who barely reads sells a powder he barely understands. A book copied by 3 scribes who speak 3 languages but share one hunger, to know more. A market where ideas cross borders faster than armies can build walls. In the end, it may not be kings who shape the alchemy of the world, but merchants, with dirty hands, imperfect translations, and the courage to trade in what they cannot fully grasp. Story 7. Alchemical Gardens, Cultivating Transformation in Monastic Europe. In the early morning chill, a Cistercian monk in a woolen habit bends over a patch of betony and marigold, carefully inspecting each leaf. The garden is not for beauty, it is for balance. Beyond the high walls of the monastery, Europe stirs, feudal lords quarrel, villages struggle through famine, and whispers of heresy drift through foggy valleys. But here, in the monastery's cloistered garden, another alchemy is at work. This is not the alchemy of bubbling alembics and clanging crucibles. It is the alchemy of roots and rot, of patience and prayer, of soil and spirit. In this story, we examine how monastic gardens across medieval Europe, especially from the 9th to 14th centuries, served as both laboratories and metaphors for alchemical transformation. We explore how monks became keepers of green secrets, and how their slow, deliberate work nurtured not only plants, but a philosophy of change that ran deep beneath the surface of medieval life. The garden as a cloistered world. Medieval monasteries were often designed around a central cloister, an enclosed courtyard surrounded by arcaded walkways. At the heart of many cloisters was a garden not for leisure, but for spiritual and practical cultivation. Monks tended these gardens with the same care they gave to illuminated manuscripts or chanted prayers. Every herb, tree, and flower had a symbolic meaning, a medical use, or a liturgical role. These spaces were carefully ordered. Beds of sage, hyssop, rue, and angelica for purification and healing. Roses and lilies planted for Marian devotion. Mandrake hidden behind stone walls, feared and revered in equal measure. Wormwood and dittany, essential for tinctures and digestive remedies. Vines and trees grown for grafting experiments, guided by lunar calendars. And while these were, on the surface, botanical pursuits, they often carried alchemical significance, especially in Benedictine and Cistercian orders, where contemplation of nature was seen as a path to divine wisdom. Alchemy by the spade. The link between gardening and alchemy is easy to overlook, but it runs deep. To medieval monks, soil was the prima materia, the base matter from which all things emerged. Composting mirrored putrefactio, the first alchemical stage of decay and transformation. Germination was multiplicatio, the multiplication of essence from seed. Grafting, splicing a branch onto another tree, was a symbolic transmutation, a forced union of two natures. The stages of gardening aligned neatly with the philosophical steps of the great work, magnum opus. Nigredo, blackening, right arrow, preparing and composting the soil. Albedo, whitening, right arrow, emergence of sprouts and purification of herbs. Citrinitas, yellowing, right arrow, flowering and fruiting under the summer sun. Rubedo, reddening, right arrow, harvest, the final perfection. Whether they knew it or not, monks practiced a living alchemy, one that unfolded slowly across seasons. The Rule of St. Benedict, Obedience and Observation. The Rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century, became the guiding document for most Western monastic orders. It emphasized obedience, silence, labor, and study, a perfect recipe for patient experimentation. Gardening was both labor and meditation. The tending of roots mirrored the tending of the soul. Some monastic records describe herbal preparations that required precise timing. Gather under the waning moon, steep for 7 days, exposed to morning dew before Mass. These were not just remedies, they were rituals. And in them, we see the early roots of what would later become formal alchemical procedures. A monk might not describe himself as an alchemist, but he was experimenting with transmutation even if his crucible was a clay pot and his solvent was rainwater. The herbals, textual alchemy. Monks did not only grow plants, they copied and expanded upon ancient herbals. Many scriptoriums produced elaborately illustrated texts based on Greek and Roman works like Dioscorides de Materia Medica, but added Christian symbolism and experimental notes drawn from daily practice. Some examples include the Macer Floridus, 11th century, blending botanical knowledge with poetic Latin verse. The Herbarium of Apuleius, reworked with Christian prayers and plant-based charms. The Anglo-Saxon Leech Book, combining plant lore, lunar phases, and magical incantations. These books often included preparations and instructions that straddled the line between medicine and mysticism. One entry from a 12th century abbey notes: boil marjoram in wine and bury the bottle beneath the ash tree on Michaelmas. Retrieve on All Saints. The vapor shall cure melancholy if breathed before sunrise. A potion, a placebo, a poetic act of faith. In the garden alchemist's world, those distinctions didn't matter. The silence of the garden. Unlike the flamboyant figures of Renaissance alchemy or the secretive Hermetic philosophers of Alexandria, the monastic gardener alchemist was quiet, anonymous, and deliberate. He did not seek gold or fame, he sought balance between the humors, harmony with the divine order, the healing of bodies, and more importantly, of souls. And while some monasteries, especially later Benedictine centers in southern France and northern Italy, experimented with distillation, mineral solutions, and metallic treatments, most focused on plants earthy, rooted, humble. Their work was rarely revolutionary, it was iterative. They didn't change the world overnight, they tended it. A planting of ideas. But the ideas they tended took root. By the 13th century, university physicians were borrowing monastic remedies, combining them with alchemical processes from Islamic Spain. They distilled tinctures, created herbal elixirs, and built proto-laboratories in Paris, Salerno, and Montpellier. The seeds planted in monastic soil had grown. Even Paracelsus, centuries later, would praise the silent philosophers of the garden for understanding what others missed. Nature speaks quietly. It is the physician's task to learn her tongue. In the end, these gardens, humble, ordered, and green, became the cradle of transformation. Not because they produced gold, but because they nurtured wisdom rooted in patience and faith in hidden change. Unresolved reflection. If a leaf becomes medicine, and medicine becomes a metaphor, and a monk through his garden sees both body and soul as soil for growth, then was his garden not a kind of crucible? Was transformation ever meant to be loud? It is late autumn in the monastery. The leaves have fallen, frost coats the pathways, and the garden appears lifeless. But beneath the soil, something essential stirs. To the monks, decay is not death, it is preparation. In this section, we explore the rituals of fermentation, decomposition, and slow transformation that define the monastic garden's alchemical philosophy. We trace how monks experimented with preservation and transformation, and how their seasonal routines subtly echoed the stages of the alchemical magnum opus. Compost as crucible. While urban alchemists pursued purification with fire and mercury, monks worked with compost, turning waste into fertility and death into growth. The compost heap, in many ways, was a monastic alembic. Left in shaded corners of the garden, it became a silent laboratory. Kitchen scraps, herb trimmings, and even discarded parchment mixed with soil. Layers were carefully arranged, often alternating green and brown elements, though monks didn't use such modern terms. Some recipes instructed that lime be added, or ashes from the refectory hearth, to temper the humors of the heap. In the dark and warmth of the pile, microbes worked their unseen magic. Over weeks and months, the mixture transformed into rich humus, dark, loamy, and alive. To monks observing this process, it mirrored the blackening stage of alchemical transformation. Negrito, the necessary decay before refinement. As Brother Matthew of St. Gall wrote in 1232, "All life must pass through blackness before it may feed new life. Even rot may be sacred." Fermentation and sacred brews. Alcohol was not forbidden in monasteries, it was refined. Monasteries across Europe, especially Benedictine and Cistercian houses, became centers of brewing. Their processes involved malting grain, a delicate process of partial germination; boiling with herbs, including bittering agents like yarrow or wormwood before hops became common; fermenting in cellars, often aligned with lunar cycles or feast days; storing in casks, sealed with wax and stamped with crosses. Though many modern associations link monastic brewing with beer, some monasteries experimented with herbal tonics and fortified elixirs, especially in southern France and the Alps. These early formulations combined alcoholic base, barley wine, grape spirits; herbs with known medicinal properties, thyme, sage, hyssop, valerian, rue; symbolic or purifying agents, myrrh, cinnamon, salt. Some of these were consumed ritually during fasts or illnesses. Others were used for embalming or as offerings on altars. To the monks, fermentation was transformation, a sacred unfolding of spirit from matter. Seasonal routines and elemental harmony. The monastic calendar was not just liturgical, it was agricultural and elemental. Each season aligned with alchemical elements. Spring air, seed sowing, pruning; mental clarity, beginnings. Summer fire, growth, flowering, intense labor, transformation through heat. Autumn water, harvesting, pressing grapes, preserving, emotions and liquids. Winter earth, rest, composting, rootwork, silence and structure. These seasons structured not only the garden work, but also devotional reflections. A monk might meditate on humility while burying kitchen scraps in winter, or contemplate transience while drying herbs at midsummer. This cyclical rhythm echoed the philosophical loop of alchemy, the idea that all substances moved through stages, decayed and renewed. One 13th century homily compared Christ's resurrection to a seed breaking its husk underground, a potent fusion of botany, theology, and alchemy. Healing through the green work. Monasteries were also medical centers. Many had a dedicated infirmary garden, planted not for beauty, but for healing. Fennel and dill for indigestion. Lavender for melancholy. Foxglove for heart ailments, though its dosage was dangerously tricky. Woundwort, comfrey, and plantain for bandages and salves. Yarrow as a styptic, stopping bleeding. Monks would prepare these with great care. Infusions, poured over dried herbs in earthenware. Poultices, ground with mortars and pestles made of stone. Ointments, melted into animal fat or beeswax. Tinctures, steeped in wine or vinegar. While not alchemy in the metallic sense, these practices relied on subtle transformation, rendering one substance into another, aligning nature with healing. And some monks did experiment more deeply. In the 12th century, Abbot Wibbald of Corvey wrote of spirit distillations, used to isolate plant essences. His cellar notes describe capturing vapors, condensing them into flasks, and administering them with caution to monks suffering from fevers. Though primitive, such notes represent the birth of European phytochemistry, hidden practices, and quiet heresies. Not all monastic alchemy was sanctioned. Some monks explored symbolic transmutation, blending Christian mysticism with pagan or hermetic ideas. These texts were rarely shared openly, but fragments survive in marginalia and prayer manuals. Drawings of alchemical circles hidden behind illuminated initials. Marginal symbols, the Ouroboros, the Star of Solomon, the 7 planetary metals. References to the Lapis Philosophorum, philosopher's stone, often metaphorically aligned with Christ or Mary. While some abbots tolerated these explorations as spiritual metaphors, others condemned them as vanity or worse, heresy. Yet in secret, some monks copied pages from Arabic alchemical treatises, inserting glosses in Latin or Old French. Their work was not organized, systematic, or revolutionary, but it whispered across generations. Grafting, a monk's metaphor for union. One of the most alchemical practices in the garden was grafting, the joining of one plant to another. In Christian allegory, it represented the union of divine and human natures, the adoption of the soul into the body of Christ, the potential for altering nature without destroying it. From a horticultural perspective, monks observed that wild rootstock could carry noble fruit, that grafting at certain times of the year yielded better results, that care and binding determined success. Some monks wrote treatises on grafting that used language drawn from alchemy: binding, transmutation, essence, perfection. For them, grafting was not just agricultural, it was philosophical. From root to retort, the slow shift to chemical alchemy. By the late 14th century, monastic gardens had begun incorporating more formal alchemical processes. Some monks constructed still rooms, where they distilled herbal waters and essential oils. Others began experimenting with salt extractions, metallic tinctures, and burning methods drawn from Arabic texts. Books like the Liber de Arte Distillandi, later printed in 1500, drew directly from earlier monastic experiments. What had started as soil-based spirituality evolved, gradually, into chemical investigation. Still, many of the principles remained the same: patience, observation, harmony with cycles, respect for mystery, unresolved question. If a monk, by pruning a rose or fermenting a tonic, believes he is perfecting nature in line with divine will, was he a gardener, a healer, an alchemist, or were those roles never truly separate? The bells toll matins in the early light. A monk, now aged and slow, walks the garden path he has tended since youth. His joints ache with the seasons. The apple tree he grafted 30 winters ago is heavy with fruit. He does not think of himself as an alchemist. But the garden in its rhythm reveals a truth: transformation is never sudden, it is a practice. In this final section, we explore how monastic horticultural alchemy gradually sowed the seeds for early modern science. We trace how the patient rhythms of medieval gardens contributed not only to medicinal and chemical experimentation, but to a broader philosophy of inquiry that helped shape the Renaissance and beyond. Echoes in the Renaissance laboratory. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Europe was undergoing profound change. The invention of the printing press, the rediscovery of classical texts, and the influx of knowledge from Islamic lands catalyzed what we now call the scientific revolution. Amid this intellectual upheaval, alchemy began to shift from mystical symbolism to proto-chemistry. And among those quietly influencing this shift were the monks and friars of earlier centuries. Their legacies included detailed herbals, copied and recopied, forming the foundation of pharmacopoeias. Still rooms and distillation processes, adapted for broader medicinal and culinary use. Knowledge of seasonal timing, elemental balance, and compound formulation. A discipline of documentation, honed in scriptoriums and infirmaries. When Renaissance figures like Paracelsus, Giambattista della Porta, and Andreas Libavius developed new theories of matter, they often built upon techniques monks had quietly refined for centuries. Paracelsus, though critical of bookish scholasticism, revered the gardener practitioner. He described nature as a book open before our eyes, one that required contemplative labor to read, echoing the Benedictine approach of ora et labora, pray and work. Libraries and laboratories. Monasteries that once stored herbs in dark cupboards began storing scrolls, then books, many of which merged spiritual allegory with natural observation. These libraries became repositories of hybrid knowledge. The Abbey of Monte Cassino housed copies of Arabic alchemical texts passed through Salerno. Cluny's herbal collections included glosses comparing Hippocratic humors to vineyard practices. Monastic scriptoria in England preserved Anglo-Saxon leech books, including early experiments with metal tinctures and boiling solvents. By the 14th century, some monasteries had rudimentary workshops, not yet laboratories in the modern sense, but spaces where herbs were distilled, minerals crushed, wax rendered, and meticulous notes recorded. While the monks rarely sought grand discoveries, their cumulative methodical record-keeping laid the groundwork for future systematic experimentation. Herbalism to chemistry, a lineage of practice. The transition from herbalism to chemistry was slow, unassuming, and deeply rooted in garden-based experimentation. Let's consider a few milestones. Distillation, initially used to create floral waters for liturgical use, e.g., rose water for washing altars. The process was refined over centuries. By the Renaissance, it became central to early chemical separation techniques. Tincture formulation. Monks experimented with alcohol-based extractions, especially for bitter herbs like wormwood. These methods prefigured solvent-based chemistry. Grafting and soil manipulation. Techniques for enhancing growth influenced broader ideas of genetic blending and selective propagation, though formal genetics was centuries away. In these and other domains, observation of natural processes in monastic gardens shaped the language and expectations of experimental science. Results were not measured in miracles, but in subtle transformations observed over weeks and years. The alchemy of patience and pattern. Modern chemistry often celebrates breakthroughs and discovery. Monastic alchemical gardening offered something different, a spiritual epistemology and understanding rooted in patience over innovation, cycles over control, analogy over abstraction. In garden alchemy, one learns not only from results but from the process itself. The monk does not ask, "Can this be done faster?" but rather, "What does nature reveal when I wait?" Even failure is accepted. If a tincture spoils, if a graft fails, the lesson is folded back into the earth, to be tried again next season. This was not science in the modern sense, but it was not superstition either. It was a ritual of inquiry, where practice was revelation. The decline and lingering roots. By the 17th century, monastic gardens began to lose their role as experimental spaces. The rise of state-funded academies, universities, and secular laboratories shifted the center of scientific activity. Yet the methodology of monastic practice persisted. Hospitals and apothecaries still used herbal manuals rooted in monastic records. Benedictine liqueurs, derived from ancient tonic formulas, became commercial products, examples of alchemy turned commerce. Botanical gardens at early universities echoed the design of cloister gardens, both in layout and purpose. Even Isaac Newton, steeped in theological symbolism, referenced alchemical texts that had passed through monastic hands. The quiet discipline of the monastic gardener became part of the scaffolding of scientific progress, a living philosophy, soil and spirit today. Though many of the monasteries have fallen silent, some monastic gardens continue to this day. Their focus is not gold, nor even medicine, but balance. They remind us that transformation need not be loud, that inquiry does not require spectacle, that slow attention to the natural world can yield revelations beyond formulae. In an age of acceleration and instant answers, the monastic model of alchemical gardening still holds a strange power. It calls us back to a relationship with nature that is both reverent and investigative. It suggests that the truest philosopher's stone may not be a material at all but a way of seeing. Closing reflection. In the monastery garden, the alchemy was never just in the plants. It was in the rhythm, the waiting, the willingness to work the same soil, season after season, without needing to own the outcome. If all life moves through decay and rebirth, if healing lies in the green, unseen processes, if wisdom grows like herbs, quietly and persistently, then perhaps the monks were right to bow their heads not to gold, but to compost. They didn't need to transmute lead into gold. They had already turned humility into knowledge.